Polar Bear Malls, police officers at airport runway, March 15th, 2025. The wind that swept across the Seward Peninsula that morning carried with it a particular quality of cold that only those who had spent winters in northwestern Alaska could truly comprehend. A cold that seemed to penetrate not just through layers of clothing and skin, but into the very marrow of bones, into the space between thoughts, into the silence between heartbeats. James Michael O'Reilly, 43 years old, 17 years with the Nome Police Department, father of 3 daughters aged 16, 13 and 9, stood outside the single-story terminal building of Nome Airport and watched the pink-orange glow of dawn spread across the Bering Sea icepack that extended to the horizon like a shattered mirror. He held a thermos of coffee that his wife Margaret had prepared at 4:30 that morning before he left their home on Front Street. The same thermos she had filled every morning for the past 11 years. The same routine that had become as much a part of their marriage as their wedding vows or the mortgage on their house, or the way she still reached for his hand in the middle of the night when the wind howled loud enough to wake her. Nome Airport, officially known as Nome Airport with the identifier OME, sat approximately 1 mile west of the town's center, a modest facility that served as the primary aviation hub for the region, handling both passenger traffic and the endless cargo flights that kept the isolated community supplied with everything from groceries to construction materials. The main runway, designated 10/28, stretched 6,001 feet across the tundra, oriented roughly east-west to accommodate the prevailing wind patterns that swept in from Norton Sound. The airport employed a small staff of fewer than 20 people during peak operations, and security was handled by a rotation of Nome Police Department officers who took shifts monitoring the facility, checking the perimeter, and ensuring that the occasional drunk or vagrant didn't wander onto the runway or cause problems in the terminal. It was considered one of the easier assignments in a department that was chronically understaffed and constantly dealing with the unique challenges of policing a remote Alaskan community where temperatures could drop to 40 below zero, where darkness consumed 20 hours of every winter day, where alcohol abuse and domestic violence rates exceeded national averages by factors that most people in the lower 48 would find incomprehensible, where poverty and isolation created conditions that bred a particular kind of desperation. Officer Tina Marie Marks, 31 years old, 5 years with the department, originally from Anchorage, but transplanted to Nome after following a boyfriend who had since left her for a flight attendant from Fairbanks, pulled her patrol SUV into the parking lot at 5:45 that morning, exactly 15 minutes before her shift was scheduled to begin. She was constitutionally incapable of being on time for anything, always arriving at least 10 minutes early, a trait that her ex-boyfriend had found endearing at first, and then increasingly annoying as their relationship deteriorated, but which served her well in law enforcement, where punctuality was valued, and tardiness could mean the difference between backup arriving in time or not arriving at all. She had graduated from the Alaska Law Enforcement Training Academy in Sitka 3 months before her 27th birthday, finishing 8th in a class of 42, with particularly high marks in firearms proficiency and emergency vehicle operations. She was 5'6", 138 pounds, with dark brown hair that she kept cut short enough to fit easily under her uniform cap, and brown eyes that her mother used to say could see right through to a person's soul, though Tina herself had never been entirely sure what that meant or whether it was actually true. The parking lot was nearly empty at this hour, just 4 vehicles scattered across the 50-space lot, their windshields covered with a thin layer of frost that glittered in the early morning light. James was driving the department's newer Ford Explorer, a 2024 model with less than 8,000 miles on it, equipped with all-wheel drive and winter tires that could handle anything the Alaskan climate could throw at them, at least in theory. Tina drove an older unit, a 2021 Chevrolet Tahoe with nearly 60,000 miles and a temperamental heater that sometimes decided to work and sometimes didn't, and this morning it had chosen not to, which meant she had driven from her apartment on Beering Street with the defroster blasting cold air at her face while she shivered in her heavy parka and cursed both the vehicle and the maintenance department that was supposed to keep it functional. James saw her pull in and raised his thermos in greeting, a small gesture that she returned with a wave through her frosted windshield. They had worked together dozens of times over the past 5 years, had responded to domestic disturbances and bar fights and wellness checks on elderly residents who hadn't been seen in days, had pulled bodies from house fires and car accidents, and once from the icy waters of the Snake River, where a drunk snowmobiler had driven through thin ice. They had that particular kind of camaraderie that develops between police officers who have seen each other at their worst and best, who have trusted each other with their lives, who have shared the kind of experiences that civilians can never fully understand, no matter how well you try to explain them. James had trained Tina when she first joined the department, had taught her the unwritten rules about which bars to avoid on which nights, which streets flooded every spring when the snow melted, which residents were harmless drunks and which were dangerous ones. All the local knowledge that doesn't come in any training manual, but that could mean the difference between going home safely at the end of a shift or not going home at all. The terminal building was a single-story structure, clad in weathered metal siding that had once been white but had faded over the years to a dingy grey, with large windows facing the parking lot and the runway beyond. Inside, the airport manager Harold Chen, 58 years old, third-generation Chinese-American, 32 years with the Alaska airport system, was already at his desk reviewing the day's flight schedule on his computer monitor while drinking his third cup of coffee from a mug that read, "World's Okayest Airport Manager," a gift from his staff on his last birthday. 6 flights were scheduled to arrive that day, all from Anchorage on smaller regional aircraft, mostly Beechcraft 1900s and Cessna Caravans, operated by various bush airlines that specialized in serving rural Alaska communities. The first arrival was scheduled for 7:20 a.m., a Raven Alaska flight carrying 12 passengers and mail cargo, followed by another at 8:45, then a gap until early afternoon when the larger aircraft would begin arriving. Harold had been the airport manager for 14 years, having transferred from Bethel Airport, where he had spent the previous 18 years working his way up from operations coordinator to assistant manager to manager. He knew every square inch of this facility, every quirk of its aging infrastructure, every weak point in its perimeter fencing, every drainage issue on the runway, every sight line from the terminal to the approaches. He had managed the airport through 2 major renovations, countless minor emergencies, 3 significant accidents, including a fatal crash in 2019 that had killed 4 people when a Piper Navajo lost power on approach, and exactly 147 days when weather had forced the complete closure of the facility. He was competent, methodical, and deeply committed to safety, with a reputation for being strict about procedures and unforgiving of mistakes, traits that made him respected, if not always liked, by his staff. His assistant manager, Karen Wolf, 42 years old, Inupiaq on her mother's side, had grown up in Nome and knew many of the pilots and passengers who came through the airport by name, by family, by the intricate web of relationships that defined life in rural Alaska, where everyone was connected to everyone else through no more than 2 or 3 degrees of separation. She arrived at 6 o'clock, her usual time, carrying a travel mug of hot chocolate and a breakfast burrito from Airport Pizza, the restaurant adjacent to the terminal that served as both a local gathering place and a last meal stop for travelers heading out to even more remote villages, accessible only by small aircraft. Karen had worked at the airport for 19 years, had started as a ticket agent for Alaska Airlines when she was 23, and fresh out of community college, had moved into operations 5 years later, and had been promoted to assistant manager 8 years ago when the previous assistant retired and moved to Arizona. She was calm under pressure, had a gift for de-escalating tense situations with upset passengers, and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of FAA regulations that occasionally surprised even Harold. The maintenance crew arrived at 6:15, 3 men in their 30s and 40s who were responsible for everything from snow removal to runway lighting to fixing broken chairs in the terminal. Bobby Nakarak, the lead maintenance worker, was particularly worried about the condition of the perimeter fence on the north side of the property, a section that had been damaged 2 weeks earlier when a driver had lost control of his truck on the airport access road during a blizzard and crashed through 30 feet of chain-link fencing before coming to rest in a snowdrift. The temporary repair they had made was holding, but barely, and Bobby had submitted 3 requests to purchase materials for a permanent fix, all of which were sitting in Harold's inbox waiting for budget approval from the state office in Anchorage, approval that seemed unlikely to come before the end of the fiscal year in June. At 6:23, the tower controller on duty, Marcus Webb, 37 years old, former Air Force air traffic controller who had served at bases in Nevada and South Korea before taking this civilian position 3 years ago, arrived and began his pre-shift routine of checking equipment and reviewing weather reports. The tower at Nome Airport was not particularly tall, just 48 feet above ground level, but it provided adequate visibility of the entire airport property and several miles of the surrounding area. Marcus worked alone during most shifts, occasionally joined by a trainee, handling both tower and ground control responsibilities for an airport that might see only 6 or 8 operations during a typical day, though that number could jump significantly during summer months when tourism increased and mining operations ramped up. He was known for his calm radio voice and his ability to handle the occasional emergency with professional detachment, qualities that had served him well during his military career and continued to serve him well in civilian life. The sky was clear that morning, unusual for March in Nome, where cloudy conditions were the norm and clear days were precious commodities to be savored. Temperature at 6:30 a.m. was -4 degrees Fahrenheit with a wind chill of -22, winds from the north-northeast at 12 knots gusting to 18, visibility unlimited, altimeter setting 30.18 inches and rising. A high-pressure system had settled over the region, bringing with it the kind of crystalline clarity that made the air seem to vibrate with cold, that made distant objects appear closer than they actually were, that made sound carry farther and sharper than usual. Marcus noted all of this in his log and in the automated weather observations that would be transmitted to pilots approaching the airport. James and Tina met inside the terminal at 6:35, as was their routine, to discuss the plan for the morning shift. The airport security assignment was straightforward, but required attention to detail. They needed to conduct a perimeter check of the fence line, inspect the runway for any debris or wildlife, check the condition of the runway lights and signage, verify that all doors and gates were properly secured, monitor the terminal for any suspicious activity or individuals, and be available to respond to any issues that might arise with passengers or staff. On a typical morning, the entire routine took about 90 minutes. And then they would spend the remainder of their shift monitoring from either inside the terminal or from their vehicles parked strategically around the property. "Heater working in your unit?" James asked, already knowing the answer from the way Tina was still wearing her parka, even though the terminal was heated to a comfortable 68 degrees. "What do you think?" Tina replied, pulling off her gloves and flexing her fingers to restore circulation. "I'll call it in again, but you know how that goes. They'll tell me it's on the list, and they'll get to it when they can, and meanwhile I'll freeze my ass off. Take my Explorer for the perimeter check," James offered. "I'll do the terminal walk-through and meet you back here in 30. You sure?" "Yeah, I'm sure. Consider it an early birthday present." "My birthday isn't until August." "Consider it a very early birthday present then?" Tina smiled, grateful for the kindness, even if she would never admit how much it meant to her. This was the kind of small gesture that defined James's character, the reason why he was respected by everyone in the department, the reason why people sought him out for advice about everything from work problems to relationship issues to whether they should buy or rent. He had a fundamental decency that seemed increasingly rare in a world that often rewarded the opposite, a quality that his wife Margaret had recognized when they met 21 years ago at a community dance held at the Nome Recreation Center, when she had been working as a nurse at Norton Sound Regional Hospital and he had been a rookie police officer who still looked impossibly young in his uniform. At 6:42, Tina took the keys to James's Explorer and headed out to begin the perimeter check. The procedure was simple in concept, but time-consuming in execution. She would drive the airport's internal access road that circled the entire property, a distance of approximately 2.3 miles, checking the condition of the fence line, looking for any damage or signs of intrusion, noting any wildlife that might pose a hazard to aircraft, and verifying that all gates were properly closed and locked. The access road was unpaved in sections, packed gravel and dirt that became treacherous when wet or icy. And this morning it was icy, the surface frozen hard as concrete with patches of snow that had drifted across it during the last storm 3 days ago. She drove slowly, methodically, scanning left and right, the Explorer's headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness that still clung to the tundra beyond the airport boundary. The fence line was chain link, 8 feet tall, topped with 3 strands of barbed wire, not particularly imposing but sufficient to deter casual trespassers and to keep wildlife off the runway. In her 5 years of conducting these perimeter checks, Tina had seen caribou, moose, red foxes, Arctic foxes, several wolves, countless ravens, and once a muskox that had somehow wandered down from the highlands north of town. But she had never seen a polar bear, though she knew they were occasionally spotted in the area, particularly in winter, when sea ice extended far enough south to bring them into proximity with human settlements. Nome sat at approximately 64.5 degrees north latitude on the southern edge of polar bear habitat, and sightings were relatively uncommon but not unheard of. The bears were primarily found on the sea ice, where they hunted seals, their main prey, but when ice conditions changed or food became scarce, they sometimes came ashore and wandered into human areas searching for anything edible. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game maintained detailed records of polar bear sightings and incidents, and Nome had experienced approximately 1 to 3 sightings per year over the past decade, usually bears passing through the area rather than taking up residence. The most recent confirmed sighting had been 6 weeks earlier, when a subadult male had been spotted near the Gold Rush Trail about 4 miles east of town, and that bear had moved on within 48 hours with no incidents. What Tina didn't know, what none of them knew as she conducted her perimeter check that morning, was that a large male polar bear, estimated to weigh approximately 1,200 pounds and measuring nearly 10 feet from nose to tail, had emerged from the sea ice 3 days earlier and had been moving steadily south along the coastline. This bear, designated Bear 847 in the tracking database maintained by the U.S. Geological Survey's Alaska Science Center, had been tagged 2 years earlier as part of a long-term research project studying polar bear movements and behavior in response to changing sea ice conditions. The GPS collar he wore had transmitted his position every 4 hours for the first 18 months, providing researchers with detailed movement data, but the collar's battery had died 4 months ago, and no one knew where he had gone or what he had been doing since then. Bear 847 had been born approximately 8 years earlier, somewhere on the pack ice north of Alaska, had survived the precarious first years of life, when mortality rates for polar bear cubs exceeded 50%, had learned from his mother how to hunt seals, how to find breathing holes in the ice, how to wait with infinite patience for prey to surface, how to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. He had separated from his mother when he was about 2.5 years old, following the normal pattern for male polar bears, and had spent the subsequent years learning to hunt on his own, growing larger and stronger, establishing himself in the complex hierarchy of polar bear society, where size and strength determined access to the best hunting areas and eventually to females during breeding season. But something had changed for Bear 847 over the past several months. The sea ice that he depended on for hunting had been thinner and less stable than in previous years, breaking up earlier in the fall and forming later in the spring, reducing the time he could spend hunting seals and forcing him to cover greater distances in search of prey. He had lost weight, dropping from approximately 1,350 pounds in early winter to his current 1,200, a loss that was not yet critical but was concerning, that was beginning to affect his strength and stamina, that was creating a constant gnawing hunger that overrode the usual caution that kept polar bears away from human settlements. He had smelled the airport long before he saw it, his nose capable of detecting scents from miles away, capable of distinguishing between the metallic tang of aircraft fuel and the organic smell of garbage and the distinctive scent of human activity. He had approached cautiously, following the coast, and then moving inland, staying low in the terrain, using his white coat to blend with the snow-covered tundra, moving with a deliberate patience that millions of years of evolution had refined into something approaching perfection. He had watched the airport for hours from a position approximately half a mile north, had observed the vehicles coming and going, had seen lights in the terminal building, had calculated in whatever way polar bears calculate such things, that this place represented both danger and opportunity. At 6:58 a.m., as Tina completed her perimeter check and headed back toward the terminal, Bear 847 was moving closer to the airport fence line from the north, approaching the section where Bobby Nakarak's temporary repair had left a weakness in the barrier. The bear moved with surprising silence for an animal of his size, each paw placement careful and deliberate, his massive head low to the ground, his black nose working constantly to sample the air, his small dark eyes scanning for movement or threat. He reached the fence at 7:04 and paused, examining it, perhaps weighing whether the potential rewards justified the risk of approaching closer to human activity. Inside the terminal, James had completed his walkthrough and was standing near the main entrance talking with Harold Chen about the upcoming inspection by FAA officials scheduled for next month, a routine evaluation that nonetheless required significant preparation and documentation. Harold was explaining his concerns about several maintenance issues that needed to be addressed before the inspectors arrived, including the damaged fence section, when the first flight of the morning, Ravn Alaska Flight 3241 from Anchorage, checked in with Marcus Webb in the tower announcing they were 40 miles southeast at 8,000 feet, beginning their descent for approach to runway 10. Marcus acknowledged the flight, verified their information, and provided them with current weather conditions and landing instructions. The aircraft, a Beechcraft 1900D turboprop with capacity for 19 passengers, was carrying 12 passengers this morning, including a doctor heading to the hospital in Nome for a temporary assignment, a mining engineer returning from meetings in Anchorage, a grandmother traveling to visit family, and 9 other people each with their own reasons for being aboard this particular flight on this particular morning, none of them aware that their arrival time would place them on the ground at Nome Airport within minutes of when everything would go terribly wrong. Tina pulled the Explorer back into the parking lot at 7:08 and radioed James that the perimeter check was complete with nothing unusual to report. The fence line was intact, except for the known damage on the north side. No wildlife sightings, all gates secured, conditions normal. James acknowledged and said he would meet her outside in a few minutes, that the first flight was inbound and they should be visible for the arrival, standard procedure, even though Nome Airport rarely had any security incidents requiring police intervention. At 7:11, Bear 847 tested the damaged fence section with his paw, pressing against it, feeling it give slightly under the pressure. Chain-link fencing is designed to keep humans in or out, but it is not particularly effective against an animal with the strength of a polar bear, especially when that fence has been weakened by previous damage. The bear pressed harder, and the temporary zip-tie repairs that Bobby had used began to fail. The bear pushed again, and a section of fence approximately 4 feet wide bent inward, creating an opening large enough for him to squeeze through, which he did with a fluid motion that belied his massive size. He was now inside the airport perimeter, approximately 300 yards from the north edge of runway 28, in an area that was relatively exposed with limited cover, mostly flat tundra with patches of snow and scattered vegetation. A prudent bear might have retreated at this point, but Bear 847 was hungry, and the smells emanating from the airport were overwhelming his caution. He could smell the garbage dumpster behind the terminal building, could smell food from airport pizza, could smell the complex mixture of scents that indicated human presence, and beneath it all was the gnawing hunger that had been his constant companion for weeks. He moved south toward the runway, not quickly but steadily, covering ground with a ground-eating gait that could, when necessary, accelerate to 25 miles per hour in short bursts, faster than any human could run, fast enough to catch a seal on ice or to overtake prey that made the mistake of thinking they could escape. At 7:14, he reached the edge of the runway, just as Raven Flight 3241 was on final approach, descending through 1,000 feet, gear down, flaps extended, committed to landing on runway 10, which meant they would be touching down at the opposite end from where the bear was positioned. Marcus Webb saw the bear at exactly the same moment that the pilot of Flight 3241, Captain Robert Tompkins, 49 years old, 23 years of commercial flying experience, 15,000 hours in various aircraft types, announced 5 miles out on final. Marcus's training and experience took over instantly, and he keyed his radio microphone with one hand while reaching for the phone to alert airport operations with the other. Raven 3241 Tower. Be advised, we have wildlife on the airport. Large animal near the approach end of runway 28. You are cleared to land runway 10. I say again, cleared to land runway 10. Extreme caution, wildlife on the airport. Captain Tompkins acknowledged the transmission with professional calm, though his co-pilot, First Officer Jennifer Hayes, 32 years old, 3,000 hours, relatively new to Alaska flying, scanned ahead with heightened alertness, trying to spot the animal. They were too far out and at the wrong angle to see the bear from their position, and in any case their focus had to remain on the landing, on maintaining proper airspeed and glide path, on configuring the aircraft correctly, on being ready to execute a go-around if conditions warranted. Marcus was already on the phone to Harold Chen, his voice urgent but controlled. "Harold, we have a polar bear on the airport, north end of runway 28, approximately 300 yards from the threshold. I have an aircraft on final for runway 10. They'll be landing away from the bear, but we need to get that animal off the property immediately. I'm notifying Nome PD to get the officers over there now." Harold felt his stomach drop. That sick feeling that comes when something you've worried about during years of managing an airport suddenly becomes real. Polar bears were the nightmare scenario for Arctic airports, large enough to cause catastrophic damage to aircraft, unpredictable in their behavior, dangerous to personnel, and protected by law, which meant you couldn't just shoot them without proper authority and justification. He grabbed his radio and began calling Bobby Nakarak and the maintenance crew, telling them to suspend all operations and get inside the terminal immediately, then switch channels to contact the police officers on duty. Nome PD units at the airport. This is airport operations. We have a polar bear on the property. North end of runway 28. Need immediate response. James heard the transmission and felt a jolt of adrenaline surge through his system, that familiar cocktail of heightened awareness and controlled fear that every police officer experiences when routine suddenly becomes something else. He was still inside the terminal, but immediately began moving toward the exit, keying his own radio to acknowledge the message and to contact Tina, who was outside near the vehicles. Tina, did you copy that? Polar bear on the airport, north end of 28. I'm coming out now. We need to respond, but maintain safe distance. I'm calling fish and game. Tina had heard the transmission and was already in James's Explorer, starting the engine, her mind racing through everything she had been taught about polar bear encounters during her training, which was essentially, maintain distance, do not approach, do not run, make yourself appear large, make noise, use deterrence if available, call for backup from wildlife authorities, and above all, remember that polar bears are apex predators that view humans as potential prey. She had bear spray in her equipment bag, a canister of counter-assault that she had carried for 5 years but never used, had never expected to use, had thought of as basically a required piece of equipment that would sit unused until it expired and was replaced. The terminal erupted into controlled chaos as word of the polar bear spread. Harold was on multiple phone lines simultaneously, calling the Alaska State Troopers, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, the Nome Volunteer Fire Department, anyone who might have equipment or expertise to help with this situation. Karen Wolf was making announcements over the terminal PA system, instructing all passengers to remain inside the building, telling staff to stay away from windows, creating a calm but firm message that made it clear this was serious, but not yet an emergency requiring evacuation. The handful of passengers who had been waiting in the terminal for various flights pressed against the windows, trying to see the bear, human curiosity overriding common sense, some pulling out cell phones to take photos or video, already thinking about social media posts. Among them was Daniel Yoshida, 28 years old, wildlife photographer from Seattle, on assignment for a magazine article about climate change impacts on Arctic wildlife, who had expensive camera equipment in his carry-on bag and who was simultaneously thrilled and terrified by the prospect of photographing a wild polar bear at close range. Raven Flight 3241 touched down smoothly on runway 10 at 7:17 a.m., the wheels chirping on contact with the frozen pavement, the aircraft decelerating under thrust reversers and brakes, slowing to taxi speed and turning onto the taxiway that would take them to the terminal. Captain Tompkins kept his eyes scanning left and right, aware that a polar bear somewhere on the airport represented a significant hazard, even though they were now on the ground. He could see a police vehicle with flashing lights racing across the tarmac in the distance, heading toward the north end of the runway, and he made a mental note to file a detailed report about this incident once they were parked. James burst out of the terminal at 7:18, wearing his heavy parka and carrying both his service weapon, a Glock 22 in .40 caliber, and a Remington 870 shotgun loaded with slugs that he had retrieved from the patrol vehicle. Alaska police officers who worked in rural areas routinely carried heavy caliber firearms capable of stopping large predators, and James was grateful for that foresight, even as he hoped desperately that he wouldn't need to use lethal force against a protected species. He ran toward Tina's position, where she had moved the Explorer to a location near the maintenance building that gave them a sight line toward the north end of the runway. "Do you see it?" James asked as he climbed into the passenger seat, breathing hard from the sprint across the parking lot, his breath creating clouds of vapor in the cold morning air. "Not yet," Tina replied, scanning with binoculars that she had pulled from the equipment bag. "It's supposed to be near the approach end of 28, but that's a big area and the bear could have moved. Marcus said approximately 300 yards from the threshold. Okay, let's move slowly toward that position, but maintain at least 100 yards distance if we spot it. Our job is to observe and keep it away from aircraft and buildings, not to engage. Fish and Game is sending someone, but they're at least 20 minutes out, probably more." They drove north on the airport access road, both officers scanning continuously, hyper-alert, adrenaline sharpening their senses. The sun had fully risen now, providing excellent visibility across the flat terrain. At 7:21, Tina spotted the bear, approximately 200 yards ahead, and slightly to the east, a massive white shape moving with surprising grace across the snow-covered ground between the runway and the perimeter fence. "There," she said quietly, as if the bear might somehow hear her voice through the closed windows of the vehicle. "Jesus, James, that thing is enormous." James raised his binoculars and felt his breath catch in his throat. He had seen polar bears before, at the zoo in Anchorage, when he had taken his daughters there for a birthday years ago, and on nature documentaries. But seeing one in person in the wild was entirely different. The bear was breathtakingly large, easily twice the size he had expected, with a massive skull and thick neck, powerful shoulders, and legs like tree trunks. The bear was currently moving away from them, heading back toward the fence line, possibly preparing to leave the airport property, and James felt a wave of relief at the thought that this might resolve itself without incident. "Let's parallel him at this distance," James said. "Maybe he'll just go back the way he came, and we can call it a successful response. Get ready with that air horn, though, in case he changes direction." But Bear 847 had no intention of leaving just yet. He had smelled something in the area, something that had triggered his interest, possibly the scent of aviation fuel or oil or some other substance that his brain associated with food sources. Polar bears are highly intelligent animals with excellent memories, and this bear had likely learned at some point in his life that human activity meant potential food, a dangerous lesson for a wild bear, but one that was becoming increasingly common as sea ice declined and bears spent more time near human settlements. He stopped moving and turned his head toward the police vehicle, his black nose working, his small eyes examining this new potential threat or opportunity. "He's looking at us," Tina said unnecessarily, her voice tight with tension. She had her hand on the air horn, ready to deploy it if the bear showed any signs of aggressive behavior, but for now the animal was simply watching them, apparently trying to decide what they were and whether they warranted attention. The standoff lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt much longer to both officers. Then the bear dismissed them as uninteresting or non-threatening, and returned his attention to whatever scent he had been following. He began moving south again, now angling more directly toward the runway itself, toward the center line where aircraft would be landing and taking off, putting himself in the most dangerous possible position from an aviation safety standpoint. "Shit! He's moving toward the active runway," James said, reaching for the radio. "Marcus, Nome PD-15, the bear is moving south toward the runway centerline, currently approximately 150 yards from approach end of 28. We are attempting to herd him away, but request no aircraft operations until this animal is off the property." Marcus acknowledged with 2 clicks of his microphone, already on the phone with the next inbound flight to advise them of the delay. This was going to create a cascading series of schedule disruptions, but safety took absolute precedence over convenience, and there was no question that a polar bear on an active runway represented an unacceptable hazard to aircraft operations. James and Tina began a careful approach, moving the Explorer forward slowly, hoping that the presence of the vehicle would encourage the bear to move away from the runway. This is a standard technique for wildlife management at airports, using vehicles to herd animals toward exits, and it usually worked with smaller animals like caribou or moose. But polar bears were different, were apex predators that feared nothing, that viewed everything else as either food or irrelevant, and as Tina closed the distance to approximately 75 yards, the bear suddenly stopped and turned to face them directly. "He's not moving," Tina said, stating the obvious because sometimes in stressful situations people need to verbalize what they're seeing as a way of processing it, of making it real. "What do you want to do?" "Hit the siren," James decided. "Short bursts. Maybe the noise will spook him." Tina activated the siren, and the sound split the cold morning air with piercing wails that echoed across the flat terrain and probably could be heard all the way back in Nome proper. The bear's ears flattened slightly against his skull, a sign that he registered the sound, but instead of fleeing as they had hoped, he began walking directly toward the police vehicle with deliberate, purposeful steps that suggested he was not intimidated, but rather was investigating this noisy object that had entered his space. "James, he's coming toward us," Tina said, and now there was genuine fear in her voice, because this was not how this was supposed to go. This was the opposite of how this was supposed to go, and both officers suddenly understood that they were dealing with an animal that did not follow the expected script, that was making its own decisions based on criteria that humans could not comprehend or predict. "Back up," James ordered. "Maintain distance. Keep the siren on. Try the air horn too." "Bo." Tina threw the vehicle into reverse and began backing up while simultaneously triggering the air horn with her left hand, creating a cacophony of sound that would have sent any reasonable animal fleeing in terror. But Bear 847 was not any reasonable animal, was a 1,200-pound predator that had spent his entire life in an environment where you either dominated or died, where hesitation meant starvation, where confidence often meant the difference between eating and going hungry. The bear continued advancing, now at a faster pace, closing the distance despite Tina's efforts to maintain separation. "James, I can't back up fast enough. He's gaining on us," Tina said, her voice rising in pitch, her hands tight on the steering wheel, her eyes flicking between the rearview mirror and the approaching bear visible through the windshield. James made a split-second decision that he would replay in his mind countless times in the days and weeks that followed, wondering if he had made the right choice, wondering if a different decision might have changed everything that happened next. "Stop the vehicle," he said. "Stop backing up and let me out. I'll try to divert him with the shotgun. Fire a warning shot. You stay in the vehicle ready to move." "James, no, Tina, that's an order. Stay in the vehicle. I need you mobile for backup." He opened the passenger door before she could object further and stepped out into the -4-degree air, shotgun in his hands, his training and 17 years of experience taking over, his fear pushed down beneath layers of professional discipline and muscle memory from countless hours at the shooting range. He stepped away from the vehicle, putting distance between himself and Tina, drawing the bear's attention to himself, making himself the target in hopes that Tina could reposition or respond if things went bad. The bear stopped advancing toward the vehicle and redirected his attention to James, this new element in the situation, this upright figure that was neither fleeing nor hiding, but standing in the open, making strange sounds. James raised the shotgun and fired a shot into the air, the boom of the discharge echoing across the airport, a sound that made passengers in the terminal jump and made Harold Chen's heart skip a beat as he monitored the situation from the operations office. The shot had the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of frightening the bear away, it seemed to anger or excite him, triggering some aggressive instinct, and he began moving toward James with increased purpose, covering ground with that deceptively fast gait that can accelerate from walk to charge in seconds. James had time to register that he had made a terrible mistake, time to understand that he had miscalculated badly, time to see his own death approaching in the form of this massive white predator, and he raised the shotgun to fire again, this time aiming at the bear itself. But before he could pull the trigger, the bear was on him. What happened next took perhaps 10 seconds from start to finish, but those 10 seconds would define everything that followed, would shatter lives and end one life and traumatize witnesses and generate investigations and news stories and ultimately become a cautionary tale about the dangers of human-wildlife interaction in a world where those boundaries were becoming increasingly blurred. The bear covered the final 15 yards with explosive acceleration, going from trot to full charge so quickly that James barely had time to process what was happening before 1,200 pounds of predator slammed into him with a force that was simultaneously unimaginable and precisely what millions of years of evolution had designed it to be. James managed to squeeze off one shot from the shotgun, but the angle was wrong, and the slug went wide, missing the bear entirely, and then the shotgun was knocked from his hands as the bear's right paw, armed with claws nearly 4 inches long, struck him in the chest with enough force to crack ribs and drive the air from his lungs. He went down hard on his back, the frozen ground driving into his spine, his head snapping back and hitting the ice-hard surface with a crack that might have been bone or might have been ice or might have been both. And then the bear was on top of him, the animal's face filling his entire field of vision, black nose and dark eyes and yellowed teeth, hot breath that smelled of fish and death, a smell that James's brain registered with primal terror, even as his conscious mind was screaming at his body to move, to fight, to do something, anything. Tina was out of the Explorer instantly, her own weapon drawn, screaming at the bear, firing her service weapon in the air and then at the ground near the bear, trying to create enough noise and chaos to drive the animal off without hitting James, who was underneath the bear's massive body. Her bullets struck the frozen tundra and sent up puffs of ice and dirt, but the bear barely seemed to notice, was focused entirely on the human beneath him, was doing what polar bears do when they have taken down prey, was using his immense weight to pin James while his jaws sought the throat or skull or any vital target. James tried to protect his head and neck with his arms, an instinctive defensive gesture that every human makes when confronted with mortal danger, but the bear's strength was overwhelming and incomprehensible. The bear bit down on James's left forearm, and James felt and heard bones snap, felt the teeth penetrate through multiple layers of parka and shirt and skin and muscle, felt pain that was beyond pain, that was something his nervous system had no adequate way to process, and he screamed, a sound that Tina would hear in her nightmares for the rest of her life, a sound of absolute agony and terror combined. Marcus Webb in the tower had a clear view of what was happening and was simultaneously on the radio, calling for emergency response and watching in horror, his professional detachment stripped away by the visceral reality of watching a colleague being mauled by a wild animal. He called the fire department, the ambulance service, the state troopers, anyone who could respond with anything that might help, his voice cracking as he tried to maintain professional composure while describing a situation that was rapidly spiraling into tragedy. The bear released James's arm and shifted position, trying to get a better angle, and in that brief moment, James tried to roll away, tried to create some distance, his training screaming at him to create space and access a weapon. But his left arm was shattered and useless, and his right arm was pinned beneath his own body, and he had perhaps 2 seconds of partial freedom before the bear was on him again, this time clamping down on his shoulder and neck area, the jaws closing with perhaps 1,500 pounds per square inch of pressure. enough to crush bone, enough to sever arteries, enough to end life with terrible efficiency. Blood was spreading rapidly across the white snow, a vivid crimson stain that grew larger with each second, James's body giving up its essential fluids with horrifying speed, his life draining away onto the frozen ground of Nome Airport. He was still conscious, still aware, his brain still processing input even as his body was shutting down, and some part of him understood that he was dying, that his wife Margaret would be waking up right now in their house on Front Street and making breakfast for their 3 daughters who would be getting ready for school, that his youngest daughter Emma was supposed to have a piano recital next week and he had promised to be there, that all the mundane details and plans and promises that made up a human life were about to become irrelevant, because in approximately 90 seconds his heart would stop beating and James Michael O'Reilly would cease to exist. Tina had her bear spray out now, had dropped her firearm and grabbed the canister from her belt, and she ran forward to within 20 feet of the bear, closer than she should have been. Close enough that the bear could have turned his attention to her with fatal consequences. And she aimed the canister and depressed the trigger, sending a cone of pressurized capsaicin-based deterrent directly toward the bear's face. The orange spray caught the bear in the eyes and nose, the concentrated pepper extract causing immediate pain and respiratory distress, and the bear released his grip on James and reared back, shaking his head, pawing at his face with his massive paws, temporarily blinded and disoriented by the chemical assault. "James, move! Get away from it!" Tina screamed, but James wasn't moving, was lying motionless in an expanding pool of his own blood, his eyes open but unfocused, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths that indicated severe trauma and possible internal bleeding. Tina wanted to go to him, wanted to drag him away from the bear and start first aid, but the bear was still between her and James, was still a massive threat despite being temporarily incapacitated by the bear spray, and she had to wait, had to force herself to remain back while the bear continued to shake his head and rub his face against his paws, trying to relieve the burning pain. Bobby Nakarak and another maintenance worker, Tony Williams, had been watching from the maintenance building and now came running with a pickup truck, Tony at the wheel, driving straight toward the bear, with the horn blaring and lights flashing, while Bobby stood in the truck bed, holding a piece of plywood and banging on the truck roof with a hammer, creating as much noise and chaos as possible. This finally broke the bear's focus, and he turned away from James and began moving north, away from the commotion, half running and half stumbling with his eyes still streaming from the bear spray, seeking distance and relief from the pain and the noise and the overwhelming assault on his senses. Tina ran to James and dropped to her knees beside him, her training taking over, even as her emotions threatened to overwhelm her, her hands moving automatically to assess his injuries and start life-saving interventions. His left arm was destroyed, bones visible through shredded tissue, massive tissue damage that was bleeding heavily, despite the cold that should have helped with vasoconstriction. His shoulder and neck area was torn open, arterial bleeding that was pulsing with each heartbeat, and Tina knew immediately that without immediate medical intervention James was going to die, was probably already past the point of saving, had lost too much blood too quickly to survive, even with the best trauma response. She grabbed her radio with blood-covered hands. "This is Nome PD 16. Officer down, officer down. I need immediate medical response at Nome Airport, north end of runway 28. Officer O'Reilly has been attacked by polar bear. Severe trauma to left arm, shoulder and neck. Massive hemorrhaging. He is unresponsive. I need ambulance and medical now, right fucking now." The dispatcher on the other end was Melissa Hannigan, 52 years old, 18 years with the department, who had handled countless emergency calls, but whose voice nevertheless broke slightly as she acknowledged the transmission and began coordinating the response. Nome Volunteer Fire Department's ambulance was already en route, having been dispatched when the bear was first reported, ETA approximately 4 minutes. Norton Sound Regional Hospital was notified, trauma team being assembled, operating room being prepared, blood products being readied. Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, who was the emergency medicine physician on duty, beginning to prepare mentally for what sounded like it would be a catastrophic trauma case. Tina pulled off her belt and fashioned a tourniquet around James's left arm just above the elbow, pulling it as tight as she could, trying to stop the hemorrhaging, trying to buy time. Her hands slick with blood that was starting to freeze in the cold air, forming crystalline patterns on her gloves. She put pressure on the neck wounds with her other hand, trying to stem the arterial bleeding that was the most immediate threat. But there was so much blood, and it was coming so fast, and she could feel his pulse weakening under her fingers, could feel him dying despite everything she was doing. "James, stay with me, she was saying, her voice breaking, tears streaming down her face and freezing on her cheeks. "The ambulance is coming. Margaret needs you. Your girls need you. Stay with me, James. Don't you fucking dare die on me." But James couldn't hear her anymore, had slipped into unconsciousness as his blood pressure dropped below the level necessary to maintain brain perfusion, his body shutting down non-essential functions in a desperate attempt to preserve core vitals, a biological triage that would ultimately fail because there simply wasn't enough blood left to keep him alive. His heart was still beating but weakly, irregularly, struggling to pump against decreasing venous return, struggling to supply oxygen that wasn't there to tissues that were dying from hypoxia and hypothermia and traumatic shock. Bobby and Tony had stopped their truck approximately 50 yards away, watching the bear continue to move north toward the fence line, wanting to stay close enough to help Tina if the bear returned, but not wanting to provoke another attack. The bear reached the damaged fence section and squeezed back through the opening, disappearing onto the tundra beyond the airport boundary, trailing droplets of saliva and nasal secretions caused by the bear spray, his eyes still burning, his aggressive energy spent, returning to whatever lair or hunting ground he had come from, leaving behind carnage and trauma and grief that would ripple through the Nome community for months. The ambulance arrived at 7:28, exactly 10 minutes after the attack began, an eternity in trauma response time, far too long for injuries this severe. Paramedics Joel Nakashuk and Amy Chen jumped out with their equipment and took over from Tina, their experienced eyes immediately assessing the situation and understanding how bad it was. Joel began establishing intravenous access, while Amy took over pressure on the neck wounds, both paramedics working with practiced efficiency that came from years of responding to emergencies in rural Alaska, where trauma was common and medical resources were limited, and survival often depended on the skills of the first responders. "What's his name?" Joel asked, his voice calm and professional despite the severity of the situation, because you always ask for the patient's name, always treat them as a person, not just a case, always maintain their dignity even in the worst circumstances. "James O'Reilly," Tina managed to say through her tears. "Officer James O'Reilly. He has 3 daughters. His wife is Margaret. She's a nurse at the hospital. Someone needs to notify her. Someone needs to tell her before she finds out from someone else." Amy was checking for a carotid pulse and finding it weak and thready, approximately 140 beats per minute, James's heart racing in a desperate attempt to maintain perfusion with decreasing blood volume. His blood pressure was unmeasurable, probably somewhere in the 60s, systolic if they were lucky, shock territory, dying territory, the kind of numbers that make experienced paramedics exchange glances that convey without words that this is very likely futile, but we're going to do everything we can anyway, because that's what we do. That's what we signed up for. They loaded James onto a backboard and then onto the stretcher, moving him into the ambulance with controlled urgency, Joel continuing to maintain the IVs and starting to push fluids, while Amy began bagging him to support his breathing that was becoming increasingly shallow and irregular. Tina climbed into the ambulance with them, refusing to leave James's side, and Tony Williams got behind the wheel of the ambulance because Joel and Amy both needed to be working on James during the transport, and there was no time to wait for another driver. The 4-minute drive from the airport to Norton Sound Regional Hospital took 3 minutes, with lights and sirens blaring, Tony driving with controlled aggression through the quiet morning streets of Nome, running stop signs and red lights, the ambulance's diesel engine roaring as he pushed it to the maximum safe speed on streets that were still icy from the previous night's freeze. Behind them, Bobby Nakarak followed in his truck, ready to help in whatever way he could, his mind replaying the images of what he had witnessed, images that would stay with him forever. In the emergency department, Dr. Sarah Okonkwo was waiting with her trauma team assembled. 2 nurses, a respiratory therapist, a radiology tech on standby, and Dr. Michael Lee, the surgeon on call who had been roused from his home and was driving to the hospital as fast as conditions allowed. Sarah was 38 years old, had trained at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, which was one of the premier trauma centers in the country, had then worked at Alaska Native Medical Center in Anchorage before taking this position in Nome 3 years ago, seeking a change from the hectic pace of Level 1 trauma to the more manageable but still challenging environment of rural Alaska emergency medicine. The ambulance backed into the bay at 7:36. The doors flew open, and Joel began giving report as they wheeled James into Trauma Bay 1. This is James O'Reilly, 43-year-old male, police officer attacked by polar bear approximately 17 minutes ago. Massive trauma to left upper extremity with compound fractures of radius and ulna and extensive soft tissue damage. Significant trauma to left shoulder and neck with arterial bleeding that was partially controlled in the field. Estimated blood loss 2 to 3 liters. Patient became unresponsive approximately 12 minutes ago, has received 1 liter of normal saline en route. Tourniquet on left arm placed in field. Vitals: pulse 148, weak and thready, blood pressure unmeasurable, respirations 6 and shallow, Glasgow Coma Scale 3, pupils fixed and dilated at 4 millimeters. Sarah absorbed this information in seconds and began issuing orders while simultaneously beginning her primary survey, her hands moving over James's body, checking for life-threatening injuries that needed immediate intervention. Let's get massive transfusion protocol started immediately. I need O-negative blood now. Get me 2 more large-bore IVs. Prepare for intubation. Get me a chest X-ray and fast exam. Call the OR and tell them we're coming up with an unsalvageable patient that we're trying to salvage anyway. Someone call his wife, but I want a chaplain with her when she gets the news. The nurses cut away James's blood-soaked clothing with trauma shears, exposing the full extent of his injuries, and there was a moment of silence as even these experienced professionals absorbed the reality of what a 1,200-pound polar bear could do to a human body. His left arm looked like it had been fed through a meat grinder. White bone splinters protruding through mangled tissue, tendons and ligaments visible and partially severed, the hand itself barely attached and clearly non-viable. His left shoulder and clavicle were crushed, the scapula visibly fractured, and the neck wounds, while not immediately fatal, had damaged major vessels that Sarah could see were going to be nearly impossible to repair without a vascular surgeon, which Nome did not have. "I need to intubate him," the respiratory therapist said, but Sarah shook her head. "His pupils are fixed and dilated. He's not breathing adequately on his own. He's essentially gone. We're going to push blood products and see if we can get a viable pressure, but I think we're looking at a futile resuscitation. Someone time this. We'll call it at 20 minutes if we don't see improvement." But even as she said this, Sarah was continuing to work, was doing everything that could be done, because you never quit until you're absolutely certain. Because miracles occasionally happen, and you want to be sure you did everything possible when you have to face the family afterward. Blood products were hung and flowing. 2 more IVs were established. James was intubated and bagged with 100% oxygen. His chest wounds were packed with hemostatic gauze, and the team worked with coordinated efficiency that came from training and experience. Margaret O'Reilly was in the nurses' locker room at the hospital preparing for her shift when the hospital chaplain, Father Patrick Murphy, 67 years old, from County Cork originally, 30 years serving various parishes in Alaska, appeared in the doorway with an expression on his face that made Margaret's heart stop, because she had been a nurse long enough to know what that expression meant, to know that chaplains didn't appear randomly, that their presence meant something terrible had happened to someone. "Margaret," Father Murphy said gently, "I need you to come with me. There's been an incident at the airport. James has been injured." Margaret felt the world tilt sideways, felt her knees go weak, felt a cold emptiness open in her chest. "How bad?" she asked, her nurse's training helping her maintain some composure even as her wife's heart was screaming that she needed to see her husband immediately, needed to know he was okay, needed to fix this. "It's very serious," Father Murphy said, which was the chaplain's way of preparing her for the worst, without actually saying the words that once said could never be unsaid. "He's in the emergency department right now. Dr. Okonkwo is with him." They walked together through the hospital corridors, passing nurses and technicians and other staff who stopped what they were doing and watched with sad, sympathetic eyes because word had already spread through the hospital's communication network the way it always does in small communities, everyone knowing within minutes that one of their own was fighting for his life downstairs. Margaret walked with her spine straight and her face composed, decades of nursing experience helping her maintain her professional demeanor. But inside, she was fragmenting, was coming apart, was preparing herself for the moment when she would push through those trauma bay doors and see whatever she was about to see. Sarah Okonkwo heard them coming and stepped out to intercept Margaret before she could enter the trauma bay, wanting to prepare her, wanting to give her some context before she saw her husband's destroyed body. "Margaret," Sarah said, taking her hands, "James was attacked by a polar bear at the airport. He has critical injuries. We're doing everything we can, but I want you to know that his injuries are very severe. His heart is still beating, but he's lost a tremendous amount of blood, and he's not breathing on his own. Do you want to see him?" Margaret nodded, unable to speak, and Sarah led her into the trauma bay, where James lay on the table surrounded by medical equipment and blood products and a team working with intense focus to try to save his life. Margaret saw the destroyed left arm, saw the neck wounds, saw the pallor of her husband's skin that indicated massive blood loss, and she understood immediately with her nurse's training and knowledge that James was dying or already dead, that the team was performing what would ultimately be a futile resuscitation, that her husband of 21 years was not coming home tonight or any other night. She moved to his right side, the undamaged side, and took his hand in both of hers, and she leaned down close to his ear and said the things that wives say to dying husbands, the private, intimate words that belong only to them, the memories and promises and expressions of love that sum up a shared life. And as she spoke, she felt his hand, which had been cold, begin to grow colder, felt whatever spark of life remained beginning to fade, and she knew it was over even before Sarah gently touched her shoulder and said, "Margaret, he's gone. I'm so sorry. We did everything we could." The official time of death was recorded as 0749 hours, March 15th, 2025, cause of death. Exsanguination due to multiple traumatic injuries sustained in polar bear attack. James Michael O'Reilly, husband, father, police officer, community member, was dead at 43 years old. His life ended on a cold morning at Nome Airport by an animal that was simply following its nature, doing what millions of years of evolution had programmed it to do, seeking food in a world that was changing in ways that brought predators and humans into increasingly frequent and fatal contact. Tina Marks stood outside the trauma bay, her uniform still soaked with James's blood that was starting to dry and stiffen in the fabric, her hands shaking uncontrollably now that the adrenaline was wearing off, and the reality of what had happened was setting in. She had watched James die, had held his life in her hands, and felt it slip away despite everything she did, and that knowledge was settling on her with crushing weight. Amy Chen found her standing there and gently guided her to a chair and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders because she was shivering despite the hospital's warmth, suffering from shock and emotional trauma that would require its own treatment and intervention. At the airport, the scene had transformed into something resembling a military operation, with Alaska State Troopers establishing a perimeter, Alaska Department of Fish and Game officers arriving with rifles and tranquilizer equipment, Nome Volunteer Fire Department creating a command post, and Harold Chen trying to coordinate operations while simultaneously fielding calls from regional FAA officials, airline representatives, media outlets that had somehow already heard about the incident, and his own boss in Anchorage who wanted minute-by-minute updates. The Bear had disappeared onto the tundra, last seen heading northwest toward the coastline, and a tracking team was being assembled with the goal of locating the animal and determining what action needed to be taken. Polar bears are protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act, which meant that any lethal action required extensive justification and authorization. But when a bear has attacked and killed a human, the standard protocol was to locate and destroy the animal due to the risk of repeat predatory behavior. Dr. Jason Bridger, the regional wildlife biologist for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game based in Nome, arrived at the airport at 8:15, with his team including 2 enforcement officers and a biologist from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Jason was 41 years old, had a PhD in wildlife ecology from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, had been studying polar bear behavior and movements for 15 years, and had responded to dozens of polar bear incidents ranging from simple sightings to property damage to the occasional aggressive encounter. But this was his first fatal attack, and the weight of it was evident in his face as he examined the scene. The blood in the snow told a clear story. The initial attack location marked by a massive pool of frozen crimson, the drag marks where Tina had tried to pull James away, the scattered equipment including James's shotgun lying where it had fallen, his hat several yards away, evidence markers being placed by state troopers who were treating this as both a wildlife incident and a potential crime scene requiring documentation. Harold Chen walked Jason through what had happened based on Marcus Webb's observations and the preliminary accounts from Tina and the maintenance workers, creating a timeline of events that would form the basis of the official investigation. The bear came through a damaged section of fence on the north perimeter, Harold explained, pointing toward the area. That fence was damaged 2 weeks ago in a traffic accident, and we had made temporary repairs while waiting for budget approval for permanent replacement. The bear was observed on airport property at approximately 7:14 hours. Officers responded and attempted to herd the animal away from the runway. The bear charged Officer O'Reilly at approximately 07:18. Attack lasted less than 2 minutes before the bear was driven off by Officer Marks using bear spray and by maintenance workers using a vehicle to create noise and disturbance. The bear exited through the same fence opening and was last observed heading northwest at approximately 07:23. Jason processed this information while examining the fence opening, noting the bent chain link and broken zip ties, considering how a 1,200-pound bear could have forced his way through with relative ease. The gap was approximately 4 feet wide and 3 feet high at its maximum, Tight for an animal that size, but manageable with motivation, and the fact that the bear had entered airport property in daylight hours suggested an animal that was either very hungry or had lost some of its natural wariness of human activity, both concerning indicators. "We need to track this animal immediately," Jason said. "Get me the helicopter if available, and I want a ground team assembled. If we can locate the bear today, we'll assess whether immediate destruction is warranted or whether we can tranquilize and relocate. My preference would be relocation if feasible, but given that this bear has killed a human, the default assumption has to be that it represents an ongoing public safety risk." The tracking helicopter, a Bell 206 operated by Bering Air Services on contract to Fish and Game, was fueled and ready at the airport within 30 minutes. Jason climbed aboard with one of his enforcement officers and the pilot, a Vietnam veteran named Frank Dodson, who had been flying in Alaska for 42 years and who knew the coastline and terrain around Nome better than anyone. They lifted off at 8:57, climbing to 300 feet and beginning a systematic search pattern radiating out from the airport toward the northwest, based on the bear's last known direction of travel. Finding a polar bear on the tundra should theoretically be straightforward, given their white coloration against darker terrain. But the reality was more complicated. The bear could cover significant distance in a short time, could seek shelter in terrain features or behind ice ridges, could potentially return to the sea ice where visual tracking became nearly impossible, and the helicopter's search radius had to continuously expand as time passed, and the bear's potential range increased. They searched for 3 hours, flying methodical grids, examining suspicious white shapes that turned out to be patches of snow or pieces of ice, fighting against time and probability, and ultimately returned to the airport at noon without having located the animal. "We'll try again this afternoon if weather holds," Jason told Harold. "In the meantime, I'm issuing a wildlife alert for the entire Nome region. No outdoor activities without escorts. Children stay inside during recess. Anyone traveling outside town needs to go armed and in groups. This bear has demonstrated predatory behavior toward humans and needs to be considered extremely dangerous until located and eliminated." This advisory, when issued through official channels and picked up by local media, would transform Nome from a community that lived comfortably alongside the reality of dangerous wildlife into a town under effective siege, where people looked over their shoulders constantly, where parents kept their children indoors, where the very landscape that surrounded them became threatening in a way that it hadn't been before. Fear, once planted, grows with remarkable speed, and by evening the story had spread through Nome's population of 3,800 residents like wildfire, with embellishments and exaggerations that made the bear larger and more aggressive and more deliberately evil than it actually was, because humans need to make sense of senseless tragedies, and creating narratives helps with that process, even if those narratives aren't entirely accurate. Margaret O'Reilly sat in her living room on Front Street, surrounded by family and friends who had materialized within hours of James's death. People bringing food and sympathy and their own shocked grief, because James had been a fixture in the community, had been the kind of officer who knew everyone's name, who had coached youth basketball, who had volunteered at the food bank, who had been genuinely loved by people who didn't always love the police as an institution, but who had respected James as an individual. Her 3 daughters were home from school, pulled out of their classes by sympathetic teachers who had heard the news, and they sat together on the couch, holding each other and crying, trying to process the incomprehensible reality that their father, who had kissed them goodbye that morning at 5:30, would never kiss them goodbye again, would never walk through that door again, would never be there for Emma's piano recital next week, or for Sophia's basketball tournament, or for Rachel's college applications that they had been working on together. The Nome Police Department was struggling with its own grief and operational crisis. Losing an officer was the nightmare scenario that every department fears, and Chief Robert Hansen, 56 years old, 28 years with the department and 4 as chief, was dealing with the emotional aftermath while simultaneously trying to maintain operations with 17 officers and trying to coordinate with multiple investigating agencies that would be descending on Nome over the coming days. He had called in off-duty officers to cover shifts, had notified the Alaska State Troopers that Nome PD would need assistance with routine calls while they dealt with the incident, and was preparing for the difficult meeting with his entire department, where he would have to somehow find words adequate to address this tragedy. Tina Marks had been taken to the hospital for evaluation and had been examined by Sarah Okonkwo, who found her physically uninjured but psychologically traumatized in ways that would require professional intervention. Sarah had prescribed a mild sedative and recommended immediate referral to the department's critical incident stress management team, had spoken with Chief Hansen about the need for Tina to be placed on administrative leave while she processed what had happened, and had made it clear that Tina should not be alone for the next several days. Amy Chen, the paramedic who had worked on James, had volunteered to stay with Tina, and they sat together in Tina's small apartment drinking tea, and sometimes talking and sometimes just sitting in silence, both women processing their own trauma in their own ways. The media descended on Nome with remarkable speed, considering the town's isolation. By early afternoon, news crews from Anchorage were booking flights on the next available aircraft, satellite trucks were being arranged, and the story was beginning to percolate through national news networks with headlines that varied from factual to sensational. Alaska police officer killed in polar bear attack. Deadly bear mauls officer at remote airport. Polar bear attacks police in Alaska. Each version emphasizing different aspects of the story, each iteration spreading further through social media where people shared and commented and speculated without necessarily knowing any real facts. Daniel Yoshida, the wildlife photographer who had been in the terminal during the incident, had captured video on his cell phone of the aftermath, shaky footage of the blood-stained snow and the police vehicles, and the general chaos, and he was conflicted about whether to share this footage with news outlets that were offering substantial payment for any images or video related to the incident. On one hand, he was a journalist, and this was news, significant news, the kind of story that deserved documentation. On the other hand, he felt deeply uncomfortable with the idea of profiting from someone's death, of turning James O'Reilly's final moments into content for public consumption. He ultimately decided to provide the footage to Alaska Public Media, a non-profit news organization, without payment, feeling that this was the most ethical way to handle the situation. The investigation into the incident began formally on March 16th, when a team from the Alaska State Troopers Bureau of Wildlife Enforcement arrived in Nome, along with representatives from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, the FAA, and the Alaska Department of Public Safety. They established a command post at the airport and began the methodical process of documenting every aspect of what had happened. Photographing the scene, interviewing witnesses, collecting physical evidence, reviewing radio transmissions and tower recordings, examining the damaged fence, analyzing the timeline of events, creating a comprehensive record that would be used both for the official investigation and for any potential legal proceedings. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell from the State Troopers, 44 years old, 15 years in law enforcement with extensive experience in wildlife incidents, led the investigation team. She was thorough and professional, conducting interviews with Harold Chen, Marcus Webb, Tina Marks, Bobby Nakarak, Tony Williams, and everyone else who had witnessed any part of the incident. Tina's interview was particularly difficult, lasting nearly 3 hours, as Sarah took her through every moment of what had happened, every decision that was made, every action taken, not in an accusatory way, but in a comprehensive way that was necessary to understand the full picture. "Why did Officer O'Reilly exit the vehicle?" Sarah asked, a question that would become central to discussions about the incident because that single decision to step out of the safety of the Explorer had led directly to his death. Tina's hands were shaking as she answered, the memory still raw and overwhelming. "He thought he could divert the bear's attention away from me, away from the vehicle. He was going to fire a warning shot to scare it off. It was the kind of thing James would do. He always put others first. He was protecting me." Was there any discussion about alternative approaches? About maintaining distance in the vehicle and waiting for additional resources? No, there wasn't time. The bear was advancing on us. We were backing up but not fast enough, and James made a command decision. He ordered me to stay in the vehicle. It wasn't like we sat there and discussed options. It happened fast. Everything happened so fast. Sarah made notes, her expression neutral but sympathetic. "And when the bear attacked Officer O'Reilly, you deployed your service weapon first before using bear spray." "I fired in the air, trying to scare it. Then I fired at the ground near the bear, trying to create noise and distraction, without hitting James, who was underneath it. The bear didn't respond to the gunfire, so I switched to bear spray, which finally drove it off. But by then..." Tina's voice broke, and she couldn't finish the sentence. The investigation would ultimately conclude that James and Tina had followed reasonable protocols given the circumstances, that the incident was a tragic consequence of wildlife behavior rather than human error, and that while certain decisions might be questioned in hindsight, the officers had acted within their training and had not been negligent or reckless. The report would include recommendations about airport perimeter security, wildlife monitoring procedures, equipment requirements, and training protocols, but would not assign blame to any individual for what had happened. The search for Bear 847 continued for 6 days after the attack, with daily helicopter flights when weather permitted and ground teams following tracks and signs when possible. The bear had essentially vanished onto the sea ice or into the vast expanse of tundra that surrounded Nome, becoming one small white shape in a landscape of white, and as days passed without any sightings, the likelihood of locating him decreased exponentially. On March 21st, Jason Bridger made the difficult decision to suspend active tracking operations while maintaining the wildlife alert and keeping the case active in case new sightings or evidence emerged. "This bear is still out there somewhere," Jason told the assembled media at a press conference. "He may have moved far from the Nome area, or he may return. We're maintaining heightened surveillance, and we're asking residents to remain vigilant. If this bear is sighted anywhere in Alaska, we want to know about it immediately. Until he's located and dealt with, he represents a potential ongoing threat." The funeral for James O'Reilly was held on March 23rd at the Nome Community Church, a modern building on West 5th Avenue that could accommodate perhaps 300 people, but which was overwhelmed by the nearly 600 who came to pay their respects. The service was attended by law enforcement officers from across Alaska, many who had driven or flown significant distances to be there, creating a sea of dress uniforms and somber faces and shared grief. Margaret sat in the front row with her daughters, the 4 of them holding hands and holding together, drawing strength from each other and from the community that surrounded them. Chief Hansen delivered a eulogy that captured something essential about James. He was the kind of officer that every community needs, and too few have. He treated everyone with dignity, whether they were a victim or a suspect or just someone having the worst day of their life. He knew that putting on this uniform meant serving people, protecting people, sometimes standing between people and danger. He did that faithfully for 17 years, and on March 15th, he did it one final time. We will honor his memory by striving every day to be the kind of officer he was, the kind of person he was. The community established a memorial fund for Margaret and the girls, and donations poured in from across Alaska and from around the world as the story of James's death reached a global audience. The fund ultimately raised over $400,000, money that would help pay for the girls' college education and provide some financial stability for Margaret, though no amount of money could fill the void that James's absence created. Tina Marks returned to work on April 7th, 3 weeks after the attack, though her assignment was modified to administrative duties rather than patrol. She was meeting twice weekly with a psychologist specializing in trauma, was experiencing nightmares and flashbacks that are characteristic of post-traumatic stress disorder, and was struggling with feelings of guilt and responsibility, despite everyone telling her that she had done everything right, that she had saved her own life and possibly others by her actions, that she was a hero rather than a failure. The rational part of her brain understood this, but the emotional part kept replaying those moments, kept seeing different decisions that might have changed the outcome, kept thinking that if only she had been faster or stronger or smarter, James would still be alive. The physical evidence from the scene told a story that supported the official findings, but also revealed some troubling details. The shotgun that James had been carrying was recovered and examined, and ballistics analysis confirmed that he had fired one shot that had missed the bear entirely, passing several feet to the left of the animal's position, suggesting that either his aim had been rushed or affected by stress, or the bear had been moving faster than he anticipated. The bear spray canister that Tina had deployed was analyzed and found to have been within its expiration date and to have functioned properly, supporting her account that it had been effective in driving the bear away. The damage to the fence where the bear had entered was photographed extensively, and structural engineers were brought in to analyze why the temporary repair had failed to keep the animal out. This last point became contentious as various parties tried to assign responsibility for the inadequate fence repair. Bobby Nakarak insisted that he had made the best repair possible with the materials available, and that he had requested proper repair materials multiple times only to have those requests denied by budget constraints. Harold Chen pointed out that he had forwarded Bobby's requests to the state office in Anchorage, along with his own recommendation for approval, and had been told that the repair was not a priority and would be scheduled for the next fiscal year. The state office claimed that they had not been adequately informed of the urgency of the repair, and that if they had known it represented a security risk, they would have approved it immediately. This circular chain of responsibility and buck-passing ultimately went nowhere, though the fence was permanently repaired within 2 days of the attack using emergency funding that suddenly materialized when a police officer's death made it politically impossible to continue delaying the work. The FAA conducted its own investigation focusing on airport operational procedures and found several areas where improvements could be made. They recommended enhanced perimeter surveillance, including motion detection cameras, improved lighting of the fence line, more frequent wildlife patrols, particularly during dawn and dusk hours when bears were most active, and better coordination between airport security and local wildlife authorities. These recommendations were adopted and implemented over the following 6 months, transforming Nome Airport's security posture in ways that would likely have prevented an incident like this from occurring, though, of course, these improvements came too late for James O'Reilly. The question of what to do about polar bears and human safety became a topic of intense debate in Alaska and beyond, with various stakeholders advocating for different approaches. Environmental groups emphasize the need to protect polar bears as a species facing existential threat from climate change and habitat loss, arguing that incidents like this were tragic but rare and should not result in wholesale destruction of bears or weakening of protections. Hunting and outdoor recreation groups countered that human safety had to take precedence and that bears demonstrating aggressive behavior toward humans needed to be removed immediately rather than after the fact. Native Alaskan communities, for whom polar bears held cultural and subsistence significance, offered perspectives informed by thousands of years of coexistence with dangerous megafauna, emphasizing respect for the animals while acknowledging the need to protect people. Dr. Thomas Morrison, a renowned polar bear biologist from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, who had been studying bears for 37 years, weighed in with an essay in the Anchorage Daily News that attempted to provide scientific context for what had happened. Polar bears are apex predators that naturally view humans as potential prey, he wrote. Unlike brown bears or black bears, which generally avoid human contact, polar bears have little evolutionary history with humans and no instinctive fear of us. When a polar bear encounters a human, it is making a calculation about whether that human represents food, and a hungry bear will often decide the answer is yes. This is not malice or evil, it's simply nature. As sea ice continues to decline and polar bears spend more time on shore, these encounters will become more frequent. We need comprehensive strategies that include habitat protection, human-bear conflict management, public education, and yes, sometimes lethal removal of bears that pose immediate threats. The alternative is more incidents like Nome, more deaths, and ultimately more public support for eliminating bears entirely, which would be a tragedy for the species. Margaret O'Reilly tried to find meaning in her husband's death, tried to understand why this had happened to him, to their family, to everyone whose lives James had touched. She attended a support group for families of officers killed in the line of duty, connected with other widows who understood the particular pain of this kind of loss, and slowly began to process her grief in ways that allowed her to function day to day, even though the fundamental reality of her life had been shattered. Her daughters struggled in their own ways, Rachel becoming withdrawn and serious beyond her 16 years, Sophia channeling her grief into basketball with almost manic intensity, and Emma experiencing nightmares that required therapy and medication to manage. In late April, Margaret received a phone call from Jason Bridger asking if she would be willing to meet with him to discuss the ongoing search for the bear. She agreed, and they met at a coffee shop in Nome, where Jason explained that the search had been expanded to include tracking data from other polar bears in the region, satellite imagery analysis, and coordination with native hunters who traveled extensively on the sea ice and might observe signs of the animal. "I want you to know that we haven't given up," Jason said. "This bear killed your husband, and I'm committed to finding it and ensuring it doesn't hurt anyone else. I know that won't bring James back, but I hope it provides some measure of closure when we finally locate it." Margaret appreciated his commitment, but found herself ambivalent about the search. Part of her wanted the bear found and destroyed as justice for James, but another part recognized that the bear was just an animal following its nature, no more evil than a hurricane or an earthquake or any other natural force that causes human death and suffering. "James wouldn't want the bear hunted out of vengeance," she said quietly. "He understood wildlife. He respected it, even knowing the dangers. If you find the bear because it threatens someone else, then yes, do what needs to be done. But if you're doing this for us, for me and the girls, you don't need to. We'll find our own way to move forward." This conversation, when Jason later shared it with his colleagues, shifted the tone of the search from punitive to preventive. They were no longer hunting the bear specifically for what it had done to James, but rather monitoring for any bear that might pose a future threat to human safety, a subtle but significant difference in motivation and approach. The investigation generated a final report in June 2025, 3 months after the attack, comprising over 200 pages of analysis, testimony, photographs, and recommendations. The report was filed with appropriate state and federal agencies, portions were released to the media, and copies were provided to Margaret O'Reilly and to the Nome Police Department. The conclusions were straightforward. Officer James O'Reilly had died in the line of duty responding to a legitimate public safety threat, had acted in accordance with training and procedures, and had displayed courage and professionalism in attempting to protect civilians and property from a dangerous predator. Officer Tina Marks had acted appropriately in attempting to rescue her partner and had used appropriate force to drive off the attacking bear. The bear's behavior was consistent with a hungry adult male polar bear exhibiting predatory behavior toward a perceived prey item. The incident highlighted the ongoing challenges of human-wildlife coexistence in Arctic regions and the need for enhanced security measures at facilities where bears might pose hazards. Throughout the summer and fall of 2025, there were periodic reported sightings of polar bears in the Nome region, none of which could be conclusively linked to Bear 847. In September, a large male bear was observed by hunters approximately 40 miles north of Nome, and the description matched what was known about Bear 847, but by the time wildlife authorities could respond, the bear had disappeared back onto the sea ice. In November, a partially consumed seal carcass was found on the ice near Safety Sound, with characteristics suggesting it had been killed by a large male bear, and GPS data from the carcass location matched the approximate range where Bear 847's collar had last transmitted, but this evidence was circumstantial at best. As of December 2025, 9 months after James O'Reilly's death, Bear 847 remained at large somewhere in the Arctic, perhaps still alive and hunting seals on the winter ice, perhaps killed in territorial conflict with another male bear, perhaps dead from injury or disease or any of the other hazards that threaten wildlife in harsh environments. The question of what happened to the bear that killed James O'Reilly would remain unresolved, adding an element of uncertainty and unfinished business to a tragedy that had already contained far too much pain and loss. The Nome community slowly healed in the ways that communities do after traumatic events, though the memory of March 15, 2025 would remain etched into the collective consciousness of everyone who lived there. The airport installed a memorial plaque near the terminal entrance honoring James O'Reilly's service and sacrifice, with a dedication ceremony attended by hundreds on the first anniversary of his death. The Nome Police Department created an annual award in James's name, recognizing officers who demonstrated exceptional commitment to community service. Margaret and her daughters created a scholarship fund to support children of first responders pursuing college education. Tina Marks eventually transferred from the Nome Police Department to the Alaska State Troopers, seeking a fresh start in a new location with fewer painful memories, though she would carry the psychological scars of March 15th for the rest of her life. She continued therapy for PTSD, learned to manage her symptoms, and eventually became an advocate for first responder mental health, speaking publicly about her experiences and encouraging other officers to seek help when they needed it, rather than suffering in silence the way too many did. Harold Chen retired from the Alaska airport system in 2026, a year earlier than he had originally planned, finding that the stress and responsibility of managing the airport after the incident had taken a toll that made continuing in the position untenable. He was replaced by Karen Wolf, who became the first Native Alaskan woman to manage Nome Airport, bringing with her a deep understanding of the community and a commitment to safety that honored James O'Reilly's memory. Marcus Webb remained in his position as tower controller, but requested and received additional training in wildlife management and emergency response, feeling that he needed to be better prepared if a similar incident ever occurred. He would often sit in the tower during quiet moments and look out at the north end of runway 28 where it had happened, remembering that morning and thinking about split-second decisions and consequences and the fundamental uncertainty of life. The broader questions raised by James O'Reilly's death about climate change and wildlife habitat loss, about human expansion into wilderness areas, about how to balance conservation with safety, about the future of polar bears in a warming world, remained unresolved and perhaps unresolvable, too complex and multifaceted for simple answers. Scientists continued to study bear behavior and movement patterns. Policymakers debated regulations and protections. Communities like Nome tried to find ways to coexist with dangerous megafauna while keeping their citizens safe. And through it all, the bears themselves continued to live their lives according to patterns millions of years old, hunting and surviving, and sometimes coming into fatal conflict with the strange bipedal primates who had spread across their ancient territories. In the end, what happened at Nome Airport on March 15, 2025, was both extraordinary and, in a broader sense, inevitable. It was extraordinary in its specific details, the particular people involved, the specific sequence of events, the tragic outcome. But it was inevitable in the sense that as long as humans and polar bears share space in the Arctic, as long as hungry predators and vulnerable humans cross paths, incidents like this will occur. The challenge for society is not to prevent every such incident, which is impossible, but rather to minimize their frequency through intelligent management while accepting that some level of risk is inherent in living in proximity to wildlife, and that occasionally that risk manifests in the worst possible way. James Michael O'Reilly's name is now part of the long history of humans who have died in encounters with wildlife, a history that stretches back to our species' earliest days and will likely continue as long as wild animals exist. His death was not in vain if it serves as a catalyst for better practices, better awareness, better respect for the power and danger of the natural world. He died doing what he had sworn to do, protecting others from harm, standing between danger and the community he served. That his sacrifice was made against a threat that was biological rather than human, that involved a bear rather than an armed criminal, doesn't diminish the courage it required or the loss that resulted. Margaret O'Reilly would sometimes stand at the window of her house on Front Street and look out at the Bering Sea in the distance, at the ice that came and went with the seasons, at the vast expanse of wilderness that surrounded Nome. And she would think about the bear that killed her husband, wondering where it was and what it was doing, and whether it remembered that morning or whether it had simply moved on to other hunts and other days as animals do, unburdened by memory or guilt or the weight of human emotion. She would think about James and the life they had built together and the future they would never have, and she would feel grief that was still sharp even as months turned to years, would feel the absence that could never be filled, but which somehow she and her daughters learned to carry and live with and eventually integrate into their continuing lives. The story of what happened at Nome Airport became part of Alaska's folklore, told and retold with varying accuracy, becoming larger than life in some tellings and reduced to cautionary tale in others, but always serving as a reminder of the thin line between civilization and wilderness in a place like Alaska, where modern airports and polar bears exist in the same space, where every day brings the possibility that those worlds will collide with consequences that range from inconvenient to fatal. It was a reminder that for all our technology and tools and supposed mastery of the natural world, we remain ultimately vulnerable to forces beyond our control, subject to the ancient laws of predator and prey that governed life on Earth long before humans evolved and will continue long after we're gone. And somewhere in the Arctic, if Bear 847 still lived, he continued his existence unaware of the human tragedy he had caused, hunting seals on the ice when he could find them, moving across the frozen landscape following patterns encoded in his genes and learned behavior, an apex predator doing what apex predators do, magnificent and terrible and utterly indifferent to human concepts of right and wrong. The bear was not evil, just as a storm is not evil or a volcano is not evil. The bear was simply being a bear, following its nature, and that nature happened to intersect with human life in the worst possible way on a cold morning in March. This is the story of how James Michael O'Reilly died and how his death rippled through a community and a family and a profession, how it raised questions that may never be fully answered, and how it became one more entry in the long, complicated history of humans and wildlife sharing space in a world that is changing in ways that make such encounters more frequent and more challenging to prevent. It is a story about courage and tragedy, about love and loss, about the price we sometimes pay for living in wild places and working dangerous jobs, and about the fundamental unpredictability of life, where one morning you kiss your wife and daughters goodbye, expecting to come home that evening, and instead, you never come home at all. The next stories. The Billings Mauling, 6 minutes of terror on Highway 87. Carl Joseph Whitman had been driving trucks for 23 years when he died on June 3, 2024, but the morning he left his home in Rapid City, South Dakota, he had no premonition of the horror that awaited him on a lonely stretch of Montana highway. His wife, Rebecca Whitman, would later tell investigators that Carl had seemed distracted that morning, quieter than usual as he packed his insulated lunch bag with the turkey sandwiches she'd made the night before. But she attributed his mood to the argument they'd had over the weekend about his refusing to see a doctor about his persistent back pain. Carl was 42 years old, stood 6 feet tall, weighed 215 pounds, and had the weathered, sun-creased face of a man who'd spent more than half his adult life behind the wheel of a Peterbilt. He had grey-green eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, a thick brown beard he kept neatly trimmed, and a small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident involving a bicycle and a mailbox that he liked to joke about at truck stops. On that particular Monday morning in early June, he kissed Rebecca goodbye at 5:30 a.m., promised her he'd be home by Thursday night for their daughter Emma's 7th birthday party, and climbed into his 2019 Peterbilt 579 with its 53-foot refrigerated trailer loaded with 26,000 pounds of frozen beef destined for a distribution center in Great Falls, Montana. The route Carl had driven dozens of times before would take him northwest from Rapid City on Interstate 90, through the desolate beauty of southeastern Montana, past the small towns of Alzada, Broadus, and Forsyth, before he would turn north on Highway 87 toward his final destination. The early June weather had been unseasonably warm across the northern plains, with temperatures in the mid-80s during the day and only dropping to the low 60s at night, unusual for a region where snow could still fall in late May. The warmth had triggered an early emergence of grizzly bears from their winter dens in the high country around the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness, and wildlife officials across Montana had been receiving reports of increased bear activity throughout the Billings area for the past 2 weeks. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks had issued advisories warning ranchers, campers and residents in rural areas to be vigilant about securing garbage, livestock feed, and other potential attractants. But no one had considered that a 700-pound male grizzly might be drawn to a commercial truck traveling at highway speeds. Carl's journey began without incident. He made good time through the Black Hills, listening to classic rock on his satellite radio and drinking black coffee from his stainless steel thermos that kept beverages hot for 12 hours. He stopped at a Flying J truck stop just outside Buffalo, South Dakota at 8:15 a.m. to use the restroom, top off his diesel tanks, and grab a breakfast burrito from the attached fast food restaurant. The cashier, a 23-year-old woman named Melissa Horvath, who would later be interviewed by multiple news outlets about her encounter with Carl, remembered him as polite and friendly, commenting on how he'd complimented her earrings and left a $5 tip in the jar by the register. Melissa told reporters that Carl had seemed in good spirits, mentioning his daughter's upcoming birthday and showing her a photograph of Emma on his phone, a gap-toothed child with her father's eyes and her mother's dark curly hair, holding a soccer ball and grinning at the camera. By 10:30 a.m., Carl had crossed into Montana and was making his way through the vast, rolling grasslands that characterized this part of the state. The landscape here was a study in contrasts, with the dark greens of pine-covered hills rising in the distance, while the immediate surroundings consisted of endless waves of pale gold prairie grass, interrupted by occasional clusters of weathered fence posts and the ruins of abandoned homesteads from the early 20th century, when optimistic farmers had tried and failed to tame this harsh environment. Carl had always found this stretch of highway both beautiful and slightly unsettling. The sheer emptiness of it, the way you could drive for 30 or 40 miles without seeing another vehicle or any sign of human habitation, just the endless sky and the grass and the distant mountains like jagged teeth on the horizon. He'd mentioned to Rebecca once that driving through here made him think about how small human beings really were in the grand scheme of things, how nature could reclaim everything we built if we ever disappeared, and she'd laughed and told him he was getting philosophical in his old age. The grizzly bear that would kill Carl Whitman had been tracked by Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks researchers for 3 years under the identification tag number GB247. The bear, an adult male estimated to be between 8 and 10 years old, had been captured and fitted with a GPS collar in the spring of 2021 after multiple reports of livestock predation on ranches near Red Lodge, Montana, approximately 70 miles southwest of where Carl was now driving. The collar had stopped transmitting data in November 2023, likely due to battery failure or physical damage, but researchers had noted in their reports that GB247 displayed unusual behavior for a male grizzly, showing less fear of human activity than was typical and demonstrating a troubling willingness to investigate human food sources. The bear had been relocated twice, first in 2021 and again in 2022, moved to more remote areas of the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness in the hope that distance from human development would reduce conflict, but on both occasions, GB247 had traveled over 100 miles to return to areas near human habitation. Wildlife officials had debated whether the bear should be euthanized as a potential danger to public safety, but the decision had been postponed pending further observation, a delay that would prove fatal. At 11:47 a.m. on June 3, 2024, Carl Whitman was approximately 38 miles south of Billings, driving north on Highway 87, a two-lane road that cut through some of the most remote and least populated terrain in Yellowstone County. He was making good time, maintaining a steady 62 miles per hour, and calculating that he would arrive at the distribution center in Great Falls by 3:30 p.m., giving him plenty of time to complete the unloading process and find a truck stop where he could park for the night. The refrigeration unit on his trailer was humming smoothly, maintaining a constant temperature of -10 degrees Fahrenheit to keep the frozen beef in optimal condition, and the diesel engine of his Peterbilt was running strong, the big Cummins X15 producing 505 horsepower that propelled the combined weight of tractor and trailer with ease. What Carl didn't know, couldn't possibly have known, was that GB-247 had spent the previous night investigating a small ranch approximately 2 miles west of Highway 87, where the bear had killed and partially consumed a calf from a herd of Hereford cattle. The rancher, a 68-year-old man named Donald Kepler, had discovered the carcass that morning at first light and immediately called the sheriff's office to report the kill, but by then GB-247 had already moved on, traveling east toward the highway. Grizzly bears have an extraordinary sense of smell, capable of detecting odors from over 18 miles away under the right wind conditions. And the refrigerated trailer Carl was hauling, despite being designed to contain temperature, was not airtight. Microscopic amounts of blood and meat particles in the air around the trailer's cooling system vents created an olfactory trail that, to a bear's sensitive nose, was as obvious as a neon sign in the darkness. The exact sequence of events that led to the attack would be reconstructed later by investigators using multiple sources of evidence, including data from Carl's electronic logging device, which recorded the truck's speed and location in real time, testimony from 2 witnesses who saw portions of the incident, analysis of damage to the truck, and an examination of tracks and other physical evidence at the scene. What investigators determined was that GB-247 had been moving parallel to Highway 87, traveling through a shallow draw approximately 300 yards west of the road, when the wind shifted and carried the scent of Carl's cargo directly to the bear. Grizzlies are not typically known for attacking moving vehicles, but GB-247's history of food-conditioned behavior and reduced fear of human activity, combined with the bear's enormous size and strength, created a perfect storm of circumstances. Carl first became aware that something was wrong at 11:51 a.m. and 43 seconds, according to the timestamp on his electronic logging device, when he saw what he initially thought was a large dog running alongside his truck in the sparse grass and sagebrush that bordered the highway. The creature was on the driver's side, keeping pace with the vehicle, and Carl's first coherent thought was confusion about why a dog would be out here, miles from any visible habitation, running flat out at what had to be over 30 miles per hour. It took his brain several seconds to process what his eyes were seeing, to reconcile the massive size and distinctive hump-shouldered silhouette with his initial expectation of a dog. And when realization finally hit him, he felt a cold spike of adrenaline flood his system. It was a bear, a grizzly bear. And it was not just running near his truck, it was chasing his truck, its huge paws throwing up clods of dirt as it powered forward with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. Carl's immediate reaction was to accelerate, pressing the throttle and feeling the Peterbilt surge forward as the engine RPM climbed. The speedometer needle swept past 65, past 70. And Carl gripped the steering wheel hard enough that his knuckles turned white, his eyes flicking between the road ahead and the driver's side mirror, where he could see the bear still keeping pace, still running, its fur rippling with the motion of muscles beneath, its mouth open and tongue lolling. Carl had seen bears before, of course, during his years of driving through Montana and Wyoming and Idaho, had seen black bears crossing roads, and once even a grizzly sow with cubs foraging in a meadow near Yellowstone National Park. But he'd never seen anything like this, never imagined that a bear could or would chase a commercial truck at highway speeds. The animal's persistence was terrifying, suggesting a level of determination and aggression that violated everything Carl thought he knew about wildlife behavior. For approximately 90 seconds, Carl kept the throttle pressed as far as it would go, watching the speedometer climb to 75 miles per hour, a dangerous speed for a heavy truck on a 2-lane highway. But his fear overrode his professional caution. He reached for his CB radio microphone with a shaking hand, keyed the transmit button, and shouted into it, his voice high and tight with panic, This is southbound Peterbilt on 87. Anybody copy? I got a goddamn grizzly bear chasing my truck. This thing is huge. Somebody please copy. The CB channel was silent, except for static, a reminder of how remote this stretch of road was, how few trucks used this particular route compared to the interstate highways. Carl cursed, dropped the microphone, and focused on driving, praying that the bear would give up, that it would lose interest or run out of stamina, that this nightmare would end. But GB247 didn't give up. The bear had locked onto the source of the smell that had triggered its food-seeking behavior, and its brain, operating on instincts shaped by millions of years of evolution, was fixated on reaching that source. What happened next would become the subject of intense debate among wildlife biologists and bear behavior experts. At 11:53 a.m. and 17 seconds, as Carl's truck crested a low rise in the highway and began descending a gentle downslope, GB247 made a decision that demonstrated either remarkable intelligence or pure predatory instinct. Instead of continuing to run alongside the truck, the bear angled toward it, closing the distance between itself and the vehicle with powerful bounds that ate up the ground in massive chunks. Carl saw the bear coming toward him in his mirror, saw it getting closer to the truck, and his mind simply couldn't process what was happening fast enough to react appropriately. He later, in the few minutes he had left to live, told himself that he should have swerved, should have tried to hit the bear with the truck, should have done something, anything different. But in that moment, his hand stayed locked on the wheel and his foot stayed heavy on the accelerator. GB247 reached the truck's left side, and demonstrating the incredible strength that makes grizzly bears one of the most powerful predators in North America, launched itself at the moving vehicle. The bear's front paws, each equipped with claws that measured over 4 inches in length, struck the aluminum side panel of the refrigerated trailer with enough force to puncture the metal, and the bear's momentum and weight allowed it to gain purchase, its rear claws scrabbling against the trailer's surface as it pulled itself up onto the side of the moving vehicle. The sound of the bear's claws tearing through the trailer's aluminum skin was like nothing Carl had ever heard, a metallic shrieking that cut through the diesel engine's rumble and the rush of wind outside the cab. Carl's eyes went to his passenger side mirror, and what he saw there would be the last coherent image his mind would fully process. A 700-pound grizzly bear clinging to the side of his trailer, its fur whipping in the wind, its dark eyes focused forward toward the cab where Carl sat. The rational part of Carl's brain, the part that had driven trucks safely for 23 years without a serious accident, shut down completely, overwhelmed by a primal terror that dated back to when humans were prey animals themselves. He began screaming, a raw sound of pure fear, and his foot came off the accelerator as his hands yanked the steering wheel hard to the left, some desperate, atavistic part of him thinking he could shake the bear off, the way a horse might buck off a predator. The truck, traveling at 75 miles per hour with a combined weight of nearly 40 tons, responded to the violent steering input in exactly the way physics demanded. The trailer began to swing out to the right, the tires losing their grip on the asphalt, and Carl felt the horrible floating sensation of a jackknife beginning. He fought to correct, sawing the wheel back to the right, his professional training trying to reassert itself even through his panic. But it was too late. Far too late. The Peterbilt's tractor unit crossed the center line of Highway 87, the trailer swinging wide behind it, and Carl had a fraction of a second to see the shallow ditch on the left side of the road rushing toward him before the truck left the pavement entirely. The tractor hit the ditch at an angle, the front wheels slamming into the depression with enough force to crack the windshield and throw Carl forward against his seatbelt with crushing force. The airbags deployed with explosive pops, filling the cab with white fabric and the acrid smell of the chemical propellant. And Carl felt something in his chest break, a sharp stabbing pain that made his scream turn into a wheezing gasp. The trailer, still carrying its forward momentum, continued to swing around, and the entire rig began to roll, first slowly, almost majestically, then faster as gravity took over. Carl's world became a chaos of motion and sound, the cab rotating around him, loose objects flying through the air, his body straining against the seatbelt that was the only thing keeping him from being thrown around the interior like a rag doll. The Peterbilt rolled 1.5 times before coming to rest on its passenger side. The trailer crumpled and twisted, the refrigeration unit torn completely free and lying in the prairie grass 30 feet away, still humming as its diesel engine struggled to maintain power. The cab had separated partially from the trailer at the fifth wheel connection, and the driver's side door, now facing skyward, had been torn half off its hinges. Inside the cab, Carl hung suspended by his seatbelt, blood running from a deep laceration above his left eyebrow, where his head had struck something during the roll, his chest screaming with pain from what would later be determined to be 3 broken ribs and a partially collapsed lung. He was conscious but disoriented, his vision blurred, his ears ringing, his mind struggling to understand where he was and what had happened. GB247 had been thrown clear of the trailer during the initial impact with the ditch, the bear's claws losing their grip on the aluminum skin as the truck lurched violently. The bear landed in the grass approximately 40 feet from where the truck came to rest, rolled twice, and came up on its feet, shaking its massive head as if to clear it. A lesser animal might have been stunned, might have fled from the noise and chaos of the crash, but GB247 had been conditioned by years of successful food acquisitions to persist in the face of obstacles. The bear's nose told it that the source of the smell it had been chasing was close, very close, and within seconds of regaining its feet, the bear was moving toward the overturned truck. Carl heard the bear before he saw it. The sound was a huffing, snorting combination of exertion and agitation, mixed with the crunch of the bear's paws on broken glass and twisted metal as it approached the cab. Carl's survival instinct screamed at him to move, to get out, to run, but his body wouldn't cooperate, his left arm hanging useless from what felt like a dislocated shoulder, his right hand fumbling with the seatbelt release with fingers that felt thick and clumsy. The pain in his chest made it hard to breathe, each shallow inhalation feeling like knives stabbing into his lungs, and he could taste blood in his mouth, copper and salt mixing with the dust that filled the cab. The bear's head appeared in Carl's peripheral vision, massive and impossibly close, peering into the cab through the shattered passenger-side windows that now faced the ground. The grizzly's face was less than 3 feet from Carl's suspended body, close enough that Carl could see individual hairs in the bear's muzzle, could see the small scars that marked its face from battles with other bears, could look directly into those dark brown eyes that held no malice, no hatred, only a focused intelligence that was somehow more terrifying than blind rage would have been. The bear was huffing, making a sound deep in its chest that Carl felt as much as heard, and Carl could smell the animal, a wild musk mixed with the scent of blood and decaying meat from whatever the bear had eaten recently. Carl's hand finally found the seatbelt release and pressed it, but his pain-clouded brain had forgotten that releasing the belt while suspended would cause him to fall, and he dropped heavily onto the cab's passenger-side wall, crying out as the impact sent fresh agony through his broken ribs. The fall probably saved his life, at least temporarily, because at that exact moment GB247 lunged forward, one massive paw swiping through the space where Carl's upper body had been hanging just seconds before. The bear's claws, each as long as a man's finger and sharp as knives, raked through the empty air and caught the steering wheel instead, tearing through the leather covering and gouging deep scratches in the plastic beneath. Carl was now lying on what had been the passenger side door and window, his body pressed against broken safety glass that cut into his back through his shirt, staring up at the bear that was literally inside the cab with him, its huge head and shoulders filling the space where the windshield had been, blocking out the sunlight and casting Carl in shadow. The bear's hot breath washed over him, and Carl could hear himself making sounds, whimpering, begging, saying words that his conscious mind didn't even recognize as his own voice. He tried to push himself further into the cab, away from the bear, his boots scrabbling for purchase on the crumpled dashboard and center console, but there was nowhere to go. The cab had become a trap, and he was caught. GB 247 lunged again, and this time the bear's jaws closed on Carl's left boot, the one he'd been using to try to push himself away. Carl felt the tremendous pressure of the bite, felt the bones in his foot crack and splinter under the force of it, and the pain was so intense that his vision went white, and he heard himself screaming, a sound that didn't seem human, didn't seem like it could possibly be coming from his own throat. The bear began to pull, dragging Carl toward the opening of the cab, and Carl's hands grabbed frantically for anything he could use as an anchor, his right hand closing on the gear shift lever, his injured left arm flailing uselessly. The gear shift wasn't designed to support a man's weight, especially not a man being dragged by a 700-pound grizzly, and it bent under the strain. But it held just long enough for Carl to reach up with his right hand and grab the steering wheel. For perhaps 10 seconds, there was a horrifying tug-of-war, the bear pulling on Carl's leg with irresistible force, while Carl clung to the steering wheel with the strength of absolute terror, his muscles standing out in cords on his neck and arms, his face contorted in a rictus of pain and effort. Later, forensic investigators would find torn fingernails and smears of Carl's blood on the steering wheel, evidence of the desperate struggle. The outcome was never really in doubt. No human being, no matter how strong or desperate, could match the pulling power of an adult grizzly bear. The steering wheel was torn from its mounting with a screech of breaking plastic and the ping of snapping metal, and Carl, still clutching the wheel in his right hand, was dragged out through the front of the overturned cab into the harsh sunlight of a Montana afternoon. The last thing Carl Whitman saw with full consciousness was the blue sky above him, cloudless and pure, as GB 247 released his mangled foot and repositioned for a better grip. The bear's jaws closed on Carl's abdomen, the teeth punching through his shirt and penetrating the soft tissue beneath, and Carl felt a sensation that was beyond pain, beyond anything human neurology was designed to process. His last coherent thought was of Emma, his daughter, and her 7th birthday party that he would never attend, and then his mind mercifully retreated into shock, shutting down the pain receptors and flooding his brain with endorphins that created a strange, dreamlike state where nothing seemed quite real. What followed would be determined by the county medical examiner to have lasted approximately 4 minutes, though the precise timing was difficult to establish. GB 247, having secured its grip on what the bear's brain perceived as food, began to drag Carl away from the truck, pulling him through the prairie grass and over rough ground studded with rocks and clumps of sagebrush. Carl's body left a trail of disturbed vegetation and blood that investigators would later photograph and document as evidence. The bear dragged him approximately 80 yards from the crash site to a slight depression in the landscape, where a long dead creek bed created a shallow ravine lined with stunted willows and chokecherry bushes. It was here, in this natural hollow hidden from the highway by the rise of the land, that GB 247 began to feed. The bear's initial focus was on Carl's abdomen, where the bear's teeth had created the initial wound. Grizzly bears typically begin consuming large prey by opening the body cavity to access the nutrient-rich organs inside, and GB 247 followed this instinctive pattern. Carl was still breathing, still technically alive, but shock and blood loss had pushed him beyond consciousness, his brain shutting down its higher functions to focus solely on the failing task of keeping his heart beating and his lungs drawing breath. His death, when it came at 11:57 a.m., according to the medical examiner's later analysis of liver temperature and rigor mortis progression, was due to a combination of massive blood loss, traumatic chest injuries from the truck accident, and the bear's feeding behavior, which had caused damage incompatible with life. GB-247 fed for approximately 23 minutes before being disturbed. The bear had consumed portions of Carl's torso and had begun working on one of his legs when the sound of an approaching vehicle caused the grizzly to raise its head and look toward the highway. The bear's face and chest were matted with blood, and its muzzle was dark with it, but the animal showed no signs of aggression or agitation, only wariness. When the vehicle, a white Chevrolet Silverado pickup truck driven by a rancher named Thomas Lee Hartwell, slowed and stopped on the highway near the overturned Peterbilt, GB-247 made the decision to abandon its meal. The bear grabbed Carl's body by one leg, demonstrating the species' incredible strength by dragging the 215-pound corpse as easily as a human might drag a sack of grain, and moved further into the ravine, disappearing into a thicker cluster of willows where the shadowed depths provided concealment. Thomas Lee Hartwell was 54 years old, a third-generation Montana rancher who operated a 2,000-acre cattle operation 15 miles north of where Carl's truck had crashed. Thomas had been driving south on Highway 87 to meet with a veterinarian in Hardin about a sick bull when he crested a rise and saw the overturned Peterbilt lying in the ditch with its trailer twisted like a pretzel and debris scattered across the prairie for 100 feet. Thomas's first thought was that he was witnessing the aftermath of a fatal accident, and his second thought was that someone might still be alive and needing help. He pulled his truck onto the shoulder of the highway, put on his hazard flashers, and reached for his cell phone to call 911, only to discover that he had no signal. A common problem in this remote area, where cell towers were few and far between. Thomas grabbed his CB radio microphone instead and broadcast a call for assistance on Channel 19, the unofficial emergency channel used by truckers and rural residents in Montana. His call was picked up by another trucker approximately 40 miles north who relayed the information to the Montana Highway Patrol dispatcher in Billings, initiating the emergency response that would eventually bring multiple agencies to the scene. Thomas then exited his vehicle, intending to approach the overturned truck to check for survivors, but stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the trail of torn earth and grass leading away from the crash site. Thomas had been born and raised in Montana, had spent his entire life in country where grizzly bears were a fact of life, and he recognized immediately what those drag marks meant. Thomas walked carefully back to his truck, opened the rear sliding window that connected the cab to the truck bed, and retrieved his Remington 700 rifle in .300 Winchester Magnum, a weapon he carried primarily for dispatching sick or injured livestock, but which also served as protection against dangerous wildlife. He loaded 4 rounds into the magazine, chambered one, and engaged the safety before slinging the rifle over his shoulder. He then grabbed his binoculars from the passenger seat and began scanning the area beyond the crash site, searching for any sign of the bear, although he didn't allow himself to hope too much, any sign of a survivor. What Thomas saw through his binoculars made his blood run cold. In the shallow ravine, approximately 80 yards from the truck, partially concealed by vegetation, he could make out a large, dark shape that he recognized as a bear. And near that shape, something else, something that his mind initially refused to identify, but which his experience and instincts told him was human, or had been human. Thomas lowered the binoculars and simply stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to control the surge of nausea and horror that threatened to overwhelm him. He'd seen death before, had put down injured cattle and horses, had found livestock killed by predators, but this was different. This was a person, a fellow human being who had been driving down the highway less than an hour ago, alive and thinking about whatever people think about when they drive, and now was lying dead in a ravine being fed upon by a bear. Thomas made the decision, a decision he would later be praised for by law enforcement and wildlife officials, not to approach any closer. He recognized that the situation was beyond his ability to handle safely, that confronting a grizzly bear that had just killed a human and was actively feeding was something that should only be done by trained professionals with proper equipment and backup. He also understood, with the cold practicality of someone who'd lived his entire life in wild country, that the person in that ravine was beyond help, that nothing he could do would change their fate, and that getting himself killed trying would only add to the tragedy. Thomas returned to his truck, keeping the rifle slung and ready, but not drawn, and settled in to wait for the authorities he knew would be coming. The first responders to arrive at the scene were two Montana Highway Patrol officers, Sergeant Michael Rodriguez and Trooper Jennifer Walsh, who pulled up in their respective vehicles at 12:27 p.m., exactly 36 minutes after Carl Whitman's truck had left the highway. Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran of the Highway Patrol, and Walsh, who'd been with the agency for 3 years, had been on routine patrol in the Billings area when they received the call about a truck accident on Highway 87. Neither officer had been briefed about the possibility of a bear being involved, and their initial approach to the scene was standard for a vehicle accident investigation. Rodriguez parked his patrol vehicle behind Thomas's truck, while Walsh pulled past the scene to set up flares and warning cones to alert any approaching traffic, a safety procedure that would prove critical as the scene would soon be swarming with emergency vehicles. Thomas met Rodriguez on the shoulder of the highway and immediately informed him about the bear and the body, emphasizing that he had not approached closely enough to confirm death, but that his observations left little doubt. Rodriguez's expression shifted from professional concern to tense alertness, and he immediately radioed dispatch to request additional resources, specifically asking for Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks personnel trained in bear response and requesting that an ambulance and fire department rescue unit be staged nearby, but not approach until the scene was secured. Rodriguez then retrieved his AR-15 patrol rifle from his vehicle, a weapon he'd qualified with quarterly, but had never fired in a real emergency situation, and asked Thomas to show him exactly where he'd seen the bear and the body. Using binoculars from Rodriguez's patrol vehicle, both men carefully scanned the ravine where Thomas had observed the bear earlier. The grizzly was still there, partially concealed, but visible through the vegetation, and even from this distance, Rodriguez could see that the animal was massive, far larger than any bear he'd seen before in his career. Beside the bear, partly hidden by the contours of the land, lay what was unmistakably a human body, though details were mercifully obscured by distance and vegetation. Rodriguez, who'd been trained to maintain professional detachment in traumatic situations, felt his heart rate accelerate and his hands gripped the binoculars tighter than necessary. He'd worked fatal vehicle accidents before, had seen terrible injuries and death, but there was something uniquely horrifying about knowing that the death in this case hadn't come from mechanical failure or driver error, but from a living, breathing predator that was still present at the scene, still a threat. Trooper Walsh joined them, and after being briefed on the situation, established a perimeter around the crash site using yellow crime scene tape secured to stakes driven into the ground, creating a boundary that would keep any curious civilians who might arrive at a safe distance from both the overturned truck and the ravine where the bear was located. The three of them then settled into a tense wait for the specialists who were en route, Rodriguez and Walsh, keeping their patrol rifles ready while Thomas provided details about what he'd observed and the timeline of events. The next arrivals, at 12:58 p.m., were Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Warden David Kowalski and his partner, Warden Rachel Monroe, who pulled up in a green FWP truck equipped with specialized gear for wildlife management. Kowalski, age 46, had been with FWP for 22 years and had extensive experience dealing with bears, including several previous incidents where bears had been involved in human conflicts. Monroe, 31, had been a warden for 6 years and had recently completed specialized training in bear behavior and management. Both wardens exited their vehicle armed with Remington 870 shotguns loaded with slugs, weapons capable of stopping a charging grizzly if necessary. And after a quick briefing from Rodriguez, they moved to a position where they could observe the ravine with high-powered spotting scopes set up on tripods. What Kowalski saw through his spotting scope confirmed the worst-case scenario. The bear in the ravine was indeed a grizzly, an exceptionally large male, and it was actively feeding on the human victim, its behavior suggesting it had claimed the body as food and would likely defend it aggressively if approached. Kowalski could also see the extent of the damage to the victim's body, detail that he carefully avoided sharing with the highway patrol officers, understanding that some images, once seen, could never be unseen, and that his job was to focus on the professional aspects of wildlife management, not to traumatize his colleagues with unnecessary descriptions. Monroe, observing through her own scope, took photographs with a camera equipped with a telephoto lens, documenting the bear's appearance and behavior for the investigation that would follow. The decision about how to proceed fell to Kowalski as the senior FWP official on scene. Standard protocol for a grizzly bear that had killed a human required euthanizing the animal, both to eliminate the immediate threat and to recover the victim's body for proper investigation and release to the family. However, approaching a grizzly bear that was actively feeding on a carcass was extremely dangerous, as the bear would almost certainly defend its food aggressively, potentially creating a situation where officers could be injured or killed. Kowalski made the call to wait for additional backup, specifically requesting that FWP's specialized bear response team be deployed from their base in Bozeman, a 90-minute drive away, and that a helicopter with thermal imaging be brought in to monitor the bear's movements and ensure it didn't leave the ravine and potentially encounter civilians. While they waited, Yellowstone County Sheriff's Deputy Marcus Chen arrived at 1:23 p.m., having been dispatched to assist with traffic control and scene security. Chen, who'd been with the sheriff's office for 8 years, set up his vehicle at the north end of the crash site and began directing the occasional vehicle that passed to continue moving, preventing rubberneckers from stopping and creating additional hazards or complications. The scene was beginning to take on the organized chaos characteristic of major incident responses. With multiple agencies present, radio traffic constant, and a growing collection of emergency vehicles parked along the shoulder of Highway 87. The Billings Gazette reporter, a 35-year-old journalist named Sarah Mitchell, who monitored scanner traffic as part of her job, heard the initial calls about a fatal accident with bear involvement on Highway 87 and immediately recognized this as a significant story. Sarah had been covering the crime and emergency services beat for the Gazette for 7 years and had reported on bear encounters before, but never one that had resulted in a human fatality in such dramatic circumstances. She loaded her camera equipment into her Subaru Outback and headed south on Highway 87, arriving at the scene at 1:47 p.m. to find the road partially blocked by emergency vehicles and Deputy Chen firmly but politely turning away civilians. Sarah identified herself as press, showed her credentials, and after a brief conversation with Chen and Sergeant Rodriguez, was allowed to park her vehicle outside the perimeter and observe from a distance, with the understanding that she would not interfere with operations or attempt to photograph the victim's body. Sarah immediately began taking notes and photographs of the scene, capturing images of the overturned Peterbilt with its twisted trailer, the emergency responders scanning the ravine with binoculars and spotting scopes, and the general atmosphere of tense vigilance that hung over the site. She approached Thomas Hartwell, who had remained at the scene, to provide a witness statement and conducted a brief interview in which Thomas described seeing the crash site and discovering the drag marks that led to the ravine. Thomas's account would form the backbone of Sarah's first article about the incident, published in the online edition of the Billings Gazette that evening under the headline, "Truck Driver Killed in Grisly Attack on Highway 87. At 2:13 p.m., the sound of rotor blades announced the arrival of a Montana Highway Patrol helicopter, a Bell 407 normally used for traffic monitoring and search and rescue operations, but now repurposed for bear surveillance. The helicopter, piloted by Captain Lisa Park, with FWP wildlife technician James Morrison operating the thermal imaging camera, made a wide circle around the crash site before moving to hover at a safe distance from the ravine. Morrison's thermal camera, sensitive enough to detect the heat signature of a rabbit in heavy brush, easily picked up the large, warm mass of the grizzly bear and the rapidly cooling body of Carl Whitman. Morrison reported via radio that the bear was still in the ravine, had not moved significantly since responders arrived, and showed no signs of leaving its location. The FWP Bear Response Team arrived at 2:41 p.m. in a specially equipped truck carrying additional firepower, including a Marlin 1895 rifle in 45 to 70 government, a powerful lever-action weapon favored by bear guides in Alaska for its stopping power at close range, and several canisters of bear spray, though everyone present understood that spray would likely be ineffective against a bear this size at any range beyond a few feet. The team consisted of 4 additional wardens, all trained in wildlife emergency response, and their presence brought the total number of law enforcement and wildlife management personnel at the scene to 11, not counting the helicopter crew circling overhead. The plan developed by Kowalski and the Bear Response Team leader, Senior Warden Robert Hutchinson, was straightforward but dangerous. A 5-person team would advance on foot toward the ravine, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid startling the bear into a charge. The team would be armed with a mix of slug-loaded shotguns, the 45-70 rifle, and AR-15 rifles, providing overlapping fields of fire and multiple stopping options if the bear became aggressive. The helicopter would maintain position overhead, providing real-time intelligence about the bear's movements and alerting the ground team if the animal began to move toward them. Everyone else would remain at the perimeter, ready to provide support if needed. At 3:07 p.m., the team began their approach. Kowalski led, carrying the 45-70 rifle, with Monroe to his right with her shotgun, Hutchinson to his left with an AR-15, and 2 more wardens following several paces behind in a diamond formation that allowed maximum visibility and clear shooting lanes. They moved through the prairie grass slowly, pausing every 10 yards to scan ahead and check in with the helicopter via radio. The afternoon sun beat down on them, and despite the cool breeze that had kicked up, all 5 were sweating under their body armor and equipment vests. The tension was palpable, each person hyper-aware that they were stalking a predator that outweighed any of them by several hundred pounds, and could cover 50 yards in under 3 seconds if it decided to charge. At approximately 50 yards from the ravine, GB-247 became aware of their approach. The bear, which had been lying beside Carl's body in a typical food-guarding posture, raised its head and stared directly at the approaching team. Kowalski, seeing the bear's reaction through his rifle scope, brought the team to a halt with a raised fist and keyed his radio to warn the others that the bear was alert and potentially about to react. For several long seconds, humans and bear regarded each other across the distance, and those watching from the perimeter held their breath, fingers tightening on weapons, everyone aware that the next few moments would determine whether this ended cleanly or turned into a nightmare of charging bear and rapid-fire shots and potential casualties. GB-247 made its decision. The bear stood, rising to its full height, and in that moment, everyone got their first clear view of just how massive the animal truly was. Standing on all fours, the bear's shoulder height was nearly 4 feet, and its weight was evident in the thick, powerful muscles that rippled beneath its dark fur. The grizzly huffed, a sound that carried clearly across the prairie, and took several steps away from Carl's body, moving deeper into the ravine and into the concealment of the willow thicket. Kowalski immediately radioed the helicopter to confirm the bear's direction of movement, and Morrison reported that the thermal signature was moving northeast, following the old creek bed away from both the highway and the approaching team. The decision was made to let the bear go, at least temporarily, and focus on recovering Carl's body and processing the scene. Pursuing an agitated grizzly into heavy cover was a recipe for disaster, and with the helicopter tracking the bear's movements, there was no risk of it doubling back toward the highway or the crash site without warning. The 5-person team continued forward more quickly now, reaching the ravine and the spot where Carl's body lay at 3:19 p.m. What they found there was devastating. Carl Whitman, husband of Rebecca, father of Emma, 23-year veteran of the trucking industry, was dead, his body bearing terrible wounds that spoke to the violence of both the vehicle accident and the bear's feeding behavior. Kowalski, who'd seen the aftermath of bear attacks before, felt his jaw clench and had to consciously force himself to breathe slowly and maintain his professional composure. This was someone's loved one, someone's father, someone who'd gotten up that morning and kissed his wife goodbye and had no idea that he had hours left to live. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Ewan, arrived at the scene at 3:52 p.m., driving the white van that served as Yellowstone County's mobile morgue. Dr. Ewan, 49 years old, had been the county medical examiner for 12 years and had performed autopsies on hundreds of deceased individuals, but she'd never investigated a death caused by a grizzly bear attack. After donning protective equipment and being escorted to the ravine by the FWP team, Dr. Ewan began her preliminary examination of Carl's body, taking photographs, making notes, and collecting evidence that would support her formal autopsy report. Dr. Ewan's initial findings, which would be expanded upon in her detailed autopsy report completed 3 days later, indicated that Carl Whitman had suffered multiple traumatic injuries consistent with a high-speed vehicle rollover, including broken ribs, a partially collapsed lung, a dislocated shoulder, and multiple lacerations. However, the cause of death was determined to be the injuries inflicted by the bear, specifically massive tissue damage and blood loss resulting from the bear's attack and feeding behavior. The time of death was estimated at approximately 11:57 a.m., based on body temperature, rigor mortis progression, and correlation with the electronic logging device data from Carl's truck that showed the vehicle's systems going offline at 11:53 a.m. when the roll began. The recovery of Carl's body was completed at 4:28 p.m., with his remains being carefully placed in a body bag and transported to the medical examiner's van for transport to the county morgue in Billings. The process was conducted with as much dignity as possible under the circumstances, and several of the responders, hardened professionals who'd seen death many times in their careers, found themselves fighting back unexpected emotion as they worked. There was something uniquely tragic about this particular death, the randomness of it, the way Carl had been going about his normal workday and had died not because of any mistake or poor decision on his part, but simply because he'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and a 700-pound predator had fixated on his cargo. While the body recovery was underway, the Montana Highway Patrol's accident reconstruction team had been processing the overturned Peterbilt, photographing the scene, taking measurements, and documenting the extensive damage to both the tractor and trailer. The team leader, Corporal Daniel Reeves, noted in his preliminary report that the damage to the vehicle was extraordinary, with the trailer's aluminum skin bearing deep gouges and tears consistent with bear claws, the refrigeration unit completely destroyed, and the cargo of frozen beef scattered across the interior of the trailer and the surrounding prairie. Reeves estimated the total damage to the vehicle at approximately $127,000, accounting for the destroyed tractor, the demolished trailer, the ruined cargo, and the cost of the extensive cleanup that would be required. As afternoon faded toward evening, the focus shifted to tracking and eliminating GB-247. The helicopter, running low on fuel, was forced to return to Billings to refuel at 5:16 p.m., creating a 37-minute gap in aerial surveillance. When the helicopter returned at 5:53 p.m. and Morrison swept the area with his thermal camera, the bear was gone. Extensive searching over a 2-hour period failed to locate the grizzly's heat signature anywhere within a 5-mile radius of the attack site, suggesting that GB-247 had moved rapidly away from the area once it abandoned Carl's body. The search for GB-247 would continue for the next 11 days, becoming one of the most intensive bear hunts in Montana history. FWP deployed additional personnel, brought in tracking dogs from out of state, set up baited trap sites, and maintained helicopter patrols covering hundreds of square miles of wilderness. Sarah Mitchell's reporting for the Billings Gazette brought the story national attention, with major news outlets including CNN, NBC News, and the New York Times picking up the story and sending their own reporters to Montana. The attack became a topic of fierce debate among wildlife advocates who argued that GB-247's behavior was aberrant and not representative of normal grizzly bear behavior, and those who favored more aggressive bear management policies, who pointed to the attack as evidence that grizzly populations in Montana had grown too large and too comfortable around humans. The bear was finally located on June 14, 2024, by a FWP tracking team working in the Pryor Mountains, approximately 68 miles southeast of the attack site. GB-247 was spotted feeding on a dead elk, and after consultation with wildlife biologists and agency leadership, the decision was made to euthanize the bear on site rather than risk another human encounter. Warden Kowalski, who'd been part of the original response team, was given the responsibility of taking the shot, and at 7:32 a.m. on June 14, he fired a single round from his .300 Winchester Magnum rifle that struck the bear behind the left shoulder, penetrating the heart and killing the animal almost instantly. The necropsy performed on GB-247's carcass revealed a male grizzly bear in excellent physical condition, weighing 697 pounds, measuring 7 feet 4 inches from nose to tail, and estimated to be 9 years old based on tooth wear. The bear's stomach contents included partially digested elk meat, vegetation, and horrifyingly, human tissue confirmed through DNA analysis to have come from Carl Whitman. The necropsy also revealed several old injuries, including a partially healed broken rib and scarring on the bear's face and shoulders from fights with other bears, evidence of a hard life in the wild. The bear's skull was sent to a laboratory for analysis, and measurements confirmed that GB-247 was in the top 5% of male grizzlies for size, an exceptionally large and powerful example of the species. In Rapid City, South Dakota, Rebecca Whitman was informed of her husband's death by 2 highway patrol officers who arrived at her home at 6:43 p.m. on June 3rd, less than 7 hours after Carl's death. Rebecca, who'd been preparing dinner and helping Emma with homework, initially refused to believe what the officers were telling her, insisting there had been some mistake, that Carl was careful, that things like this didn't happen to people like them. The reality didn't truly sink in until later that evening, when the officers, with painful gentleness, provided more details about the circumstances of Carl's death. Rebecca's screams of grief brought neighbors running to her house, and Emma, 7 years old, and unable to fully comprehend that her father was gone forever, clung to her mother and cried because her mother was crying, not yet understanding the enormity of the loss that would shape the rest of her childhood. The funeral for Carl Joseph Whitman was held on June 10, 2024, at the First Lutheran Church in Rapid City, with more than 300 people attending, including dozens of Carl's fellow truck drivers who'd traveled from across the region to pay their respects. The service was covered discreetly by Sarah Mitchell, who'd been given permission by the family to attend, and her article about the funeral, published in the Billings Gazette under the headline, "Truck Driver Remembered as Devoted Father, Skilled Professional," painted a portrait of a man who'd been deeply loved by his family and respected by his peers. Several speakers at the funeral talked about Carl's kindness, his work ethic, and his love for his daughter, and more than one mentioned how Carl had always said that the open road was where he felt most free, a tragic irony given how his life had ended. The investigation into the attack, conducted jointly by the Montana Highway Patrol, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and the National Park Service's Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team, concluded that the incident was a combination of tragic circumstances and aberrant bear behavior. The report, released on July 29, 2024, noted that GB247 had a documented history of food-conditioned behavior and reduced fear of humans, factors that should have resulted in the bear being euthanized earlier under FWP's bear management protocols. The report recommended enhanced tracking of problem bears, stricter criteria for when to remove bears from the wild population, and improved communication between FWP and other agencies about bears with concerning behavior patterns. The report also addressed the question of whether Carl could have done anything differently to survive the encounter. The investigators concluded that once GB247 locked onto Carl's truck and began chasing it, there were no good options available. Attempting to outrun the bear had been Carl's instinctive response, and arguably the most reasonable choice. But the bear's extraordinary persistence and willingness to physically attack a moving vehicle was unprecedented in the investigators' experience. The truck accident that resulted from Carl's evasive maneuver might have been avoided if Carl had maintained his speed and course, but expecting someone to drive calmly with a 700-pound grizzly chasing their vehicle was unrealistic. The report's conclusion was stark. Carl Whitman was the victim of an extraordinarily rare and tragic confluence of circumstances that could not reasonably have been predicted or prevented. The civil lawsuit filed by Rebecca Whitman against Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks in September 2024 sought $10 million in damages, arguing that the agency's failure to euthanize GB247, despite the bear's documented history of problem behavior, constituted negligence that directly led to Carl's death. The case became a focal point for the ongoing debate about bear management in Montana, with wildlife advocates arguing that removing bears based on behavior patterns was difficult and imprecise, while others maintained that public safety should take precedence over wildlife conservation when a clear threat existed. The lawsuit was eventually settled out of court in March 2025 for an undisclosed sum, with FWP admitting no wrongdoing but agreeing to implement enhanced bear monitoring protocols and provide financial compensation to the Whitman family. Emma Whitman's 7th birthday party, which had been scheduled for June 6, 2024, was quietly cancelled, and the day passed unmarked, except for Emma asking her mother repeatedly when Daddy would be home, still not fully processing that he would never come home again. Rebecca Whitman, struggling with her own overwhelming grief, sought counseling for both herself and Emma, beginning a long process of learning to live with the loss. Rebecca would later describe the months following Carl's death as a blur of pain and exhaustion, each day an effort to simply get out of bed and function for Emma's sake. the house feeling empty and wrong without Carl's presence, without his voice calling out greetings when he came home from a run, without his laughter and his terrible jokes, and his habit of leaving his boots by the door, even though Rebecca had asked him 1,000 times to put them in the closet. The emotional trauma extended beyond the immediate family. Thomas Hartwell, the rancher who'd discovered the attack scene, struggled with nightmares and intrusive thoughts about what he'd seen that day. Images that would flash into his mind at unexpected moments and leave him shaken and nauseous. He eventually sought therapy for what a psychologist diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder, and while he continued to work his ranch, he reported that driving on Highway 87 past the site of the attack always made his hands tighten on the steering wheel and his heart rate accelerate. Warden David Kowalski, who'd led the team that recovered Carl's body and who'd fired the shot that killed GB-247, told his supervisor in a confidential conversation that he questioned whether he was still effective in his role, whether seeing what a bear could do to a human being had fundamentally changed how he approached wildlife management. For the truck-driving community, Carl Whitman's death became a cautionary tale and a source of anxiety. Discussion forums and social media groups for professional drivers filled with threads about the attack, with drivers sharing their own close encounters with wildlife and debating what they would do if faced with a similar situation. Some drivers reported changing their routes to avoid areas with high bear populations, while others invested in air horns or other noise-making devices they hoped might deter wildlife from approaching their vehicles. The incident highlighted the reality that professional truck drivers, despite spending most of their working hours in powerful machines that seemed to offer protection from the natural world, were still vulnerable to dangers that most people never considered. The section of Highway 87 where Carl died became an unofficial memorial site, with people leaving flowers, notes, and small crosses beside the road at the approximate location of the crash. Montana Department of Transportation workers, tasked with maintaining the highway, reported finding these memorials regularly through the summer and fall of 2024, evidence that Carl's death had resonated with people far beyond his immediate circle of family and friends. Some of the notes left at the site were from other truck drivers, messages like, "Rest easy, driver, your wheels are still turning somewhere," and 10-4, "Good buddy, see you on the flip side." Others were from people who'd never known Carl, but who'd been moved by his story, offering prayers for his family and reflections on the fragility of life. The scientific community also grappled with the implications of the attack. The fact that GB-247 had chased and attacked a moving semi-truck represented behavior so far outside the normal parameters of grizzly bear activity that it challenged existing models of bear behavior and human-bear conflict. Researchers published several papers analyzing the incident, with some suggesting that climate change and resulting shifts in food availability might be pushing bears into increasingly desperate and risky food-seeking behavior, while others argued that the attack was simply an aberration, a statistical outlier that didn't indicate any broader trend. The debate remained unresolved, but the incident became a case study in wildlife management programs across North America, a tragic example of what could happen when the boundaries between human activity and wild predators blurred. Dr. Patricia Ewan, the medical examiner who'd examined Carl's body, included a rarely used statement in her final autopsy report, a paragraph expressing her personal reactions to the case. She wrote, "In my 12 years as a medical examiner, I have investigated deaths from virtually every cause imaginable, but the examination of Carl Whitman's remains affected me in a way that few cases have. The violence of the injuries, the knowledge that he survived the initial truck accident only to suffer a death of unimaginable horror, and the brutal randomness of the entire event have stayed with me. Mr. Whitman deserved better than the death he received. He was simply doing his job, driving a truck down a highway, and he encountered a convergence of circumstances so unlikely that they almost defy probability. My heart breaks for his family, and I hope they can eventually find some measure of peace. Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, the highway patrol officer who'd been among the first responders, requested and received a transfer to administrative duties 6 months after the incident, telling his supervisor that he was no longer comfortable working accident scenes, that every time he approached an overturned vehicle, he saw Carl Whitman's truck lying in that ditch, and imagined what the driver had experienced in those final terrible minutes. Rodriguez's request was granted without prejudice, and he spent the remainder of his career with the Highway Patrol, working in training and safety education, where he used the lessons learned from Carl's death to teach new officers about the unexpected dangers they might encounter in Montana's backcountry. Rebecca Whitman eventually made the decision to leave Rapid City, unable to live in the house where she and Carl had built their life together, unable to drive past the Flying J truck stop where Carl used to fuel up and grab coffee, unable to see semi-trucks on the highway without thinking about her husband and the senseless way he died. She and Emma moved to Sioux Falls in August 2025, seeking a fresh start in a place without so many memories. Emma, now 8 years old, had begun to show signs of working through her grief, though she still asked questions about her father that broke Rebecca's heart. Did Daddy hurt when the bear got him? Is Daddy watching me from heaven? Why did the bear want to hurt Daddy? The Peterbilt 579 that Carl had been driving was eventually recovered from the crash site and transported to a salvage yard in Billings, where it was stripped for parts before the remains were crushed and recycled. The trailer, too damaged to be repaired, met the same fate. The frozen beef that had been Carl's cargo, scattered across the prairie and contaminated by the crash, was collected and disposed of as biohazardous waste. Nothing remained of the truck that Carl had driven for 3 years and over 200,000 miles, the vehicle that had been his mobile office and his home away from home during long runs across the western states. In the end, Carl Joseph Whitman's death was recorded as case number MT 2024-0603001 in the Montana Grizzly Bear Attack Database, a clinical designation that reduced 6 minutes of unimaginable terror and 42 years of life to a series of numbers and codes. But for those who knew him, for Rebecca and Emma and the 300 people who attended his funeral, for Thomas Hartwell who found him, for David Kowalski who recovered his body, for Sarah Mitchell who told his story, Carl was more than a statistic. He was a husband who left notes in his wife's lunch bag when they were packing for work at the same time. He was a father who taught his daughter to ride a bike and always made sure to call home every night when he was on the road. He was a professional who took pride in his work and had a perfect safety record over 23 years of driving. He was a human being who deserved to live out his natural span of years, to see his daughter grow up, to grow old with the woman he loved. The grizzly bear that killed him, GB247, was neither evil nor malicious, simply an animal following the behavioral programming shaped by evolution and individual experience, seeking food with the single-minded determination that ensured survival in the wild. The bear's death, necessary as it was for public safety and emotional closure, represented a tragedy of its own, the loss of a magnificent predator that was only doing what bears do. The real tragedy lay in the collision between these two lives, human and animal, both trying to exist in a world where human development and wild nature increasingly overlapped with consequences that could be deadly. Highway 87 still carries traffic north toward Billings and south toward Hardin, unchanged except for a slight depression in the prairie grass where Carl's truck came to rest, a depression that will eventually disappear as weather and time erase all physical evidence that anything unusual happened there. Trucks still haul cargo along this route. Drivers still cover the lonely miles through Montana's vast grasslands, and occasionally those drivers see bears in the distance and feel a small chill of unease, wondering if what happened to Carl Whitman could happen to them. The answer, statistically speaking, is no, that the circumstances that led to Carl's death were so unlikely as to be nearly impossible to replicate. But statistics are cold comfort to Rebecca and Emma Whitman, who know with absolute certainty that impossible things can and do happen, that a normal Monday morning can turn into tragedy in the span of 6 minutes, that the people we love can be taken from us in ways so random and senseless that they seem like cruel jokes played by an indifferent universe. The memorial service held on the 1-year anniversary of Carl's death brought together many of the people whose lives had been touched by the tragedy. Rebecca and Emma made the trip from Sioux Falls back to Rapid City, where a memorial plaque had been installed in Carl's honor at the trucking company, where he'd been employed for 15 years. The plaque featured a photograph of Carl smiling in his work uniform and bore an inscription that read, "Carl Joseph Whitman, 1982 to 2024, devoted husband, loving father, professional driver, forever missed." During the service, several of Carl's former colleagues shared stories about him, painting a picture of a man who was generous with his time and advice to younger drivers, who could fix almost anything mechanical with a wrench and some determination, who had a gift for diffusing tense situations with humor and common sense. Emma, now 8 years old and more able to articulate her feelings about her father's death, read a short poem she'd written at school with her mother's help. The poem, titled Daddy's Highway, talked about how her father was now driving trucks in heaven, delivering clouds to angels, and how she knew he was watching over her and her mother from wherever he was. There wasn't a dry eye in the room when Emma finished reading, her small voice clear and steady despite the enormity of what she was saying, and Rebecca held her daughter close afterward, whispering that Daddy would have been so proud of her. The broader implications of Carl Whitman's death continued to ripple through Montana's wildlife management and political landscapes long after the initial media attention faded. The Montana State Legislature convened hearings in the fall of 2024 to review grizzly bear management policies, with testimony from wildlife biologists, ranchers, outdoor recreation groups, and families affected by bear conflicts. The hearings produced recommendations for enhanced funding for non-lethal bear management tools like electric fencing and bear-resistant containers, increased staffing for FWP to allow more intensive monitoring of problem bears, and clearer criteria for when bears should be removed from the population. However, implementation of these recommendations was slow and uneven, hampered by budget constraints and the political complexity of wildlife management in a state where attitudes toward predators ranged from preservationist to aggressively hostile. The trucking company that had employed Carl Whitman implemented new policies requiring drivers to report any wildlife encounters during their runs, maintaining a database of incidents that could be used to identify high-risk routes and times. The company also began providing wildlife awareness training to all drivers operating in bear country, teaching them about bear behavior and what to do if a wildlife encounter occurred. These policies, born directly from the tragedy of Carl's death, likely prevented future incidents, though it was impossible to quantify how many drivers might have been saved by the increased awareness and preparedness. Sarah Mitchell, the Billings Gazette reporter who'd covered the story from the beginning, eventually compiled her articles and additional research into a book published in 2026 titled 6 Minutes, The Carl Whitman Story and the Future of Human-Wildlife Conflict in the American West. The book, which became a regional bestseller and was praised for its balanced treatment of the complex issues involved, dedicated its proceeds to a scholarship fund established in Carl's name for children of professional truck drivers. Sarah's book brought renewed attention to Carl's story and sparked discussions about human-wildlife conflict in communities across the western United States, contributing to a broader conversation about how to balance conservation of apex predators with legitimate concerns about public safety. For Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, the agency that had been responsible for managing GB 247 before the attack, the incident prompted a comprehensive review of protocols and decision-making processes regarding problem bears. The internal review, while not publicly released in full, led to significant changes in how the agency tracked and responded to bears exhibiting concerning behavior. The threshold for relocating or euthanizing bears with repeated human conflicts was lowered. GPS collar technology was improved to reduce failures, like the one that had left GB 247 unmonitored for months before the attack, and coordination with other agencies was enhanced to ensure that information about dangerous animals was shared more effectively. Yet despite all these changes, all the policies and procedures and enhanced awareness, there remained a fundamental truth that no amount of planning or preparation could fully address: the inherent unpredictability of wild animals and the unavoidable risks that came with sharing landscape with apex predators. Grizzly bears had roamed the mountains and plains of Montana for thousands of years before humans arrived, and would presumably continue to do so long into the future. And as long as bears and humans occupied the same spaces, there would always be the potential for conflict, for tragedy, for moments when the boundary between civilization and wilderness collapsed with devastating consequences. The psychological research conducted on the impact of Carl's death revealed interesting patterns. Studies showed that people living in bear country who heard about the attack fell into roughly 3 categories in their response. Those who became more fearful and modified their behavior significantly, avoiding backcountry recreation or taking extensive precautions. Those who acknowledged the risk but contextualized it as extremely low probability and made only minor adjustments to their behavior. And those who dismissed the attack as a complete fluke that didn't warrant any changes in how they approached life in bear country. These response patterns mirrored broader human reactions to low probability but high consequence risks and provided insights into risk perception and decision-making that extended well beyond wildlife management. For Emma Whitman, growing up without her father shaped her development in ways both obvious and subtle. She struggled with separation anxiety, becoming intensely worried whenever her mother was out of sight for extended periods, a common reaction in children who'd experienced the sudden loss of a parent. She also developed a fear of large animals that required patient work with therapists to manage. Though she never completely overcame her discomfort around dogs larger than a Cocker Spaniel. Yet Emma also showed remarkable resilience, channeling some of her grief into academic achievement and a fierce determination to make her father proud, even though he would never see her accomplishments. Rebecca reported that Emma often talked to her father's photograph, telling him about her day and her successes and her struggles, and that these one-sided conversations seemed to bring her daughter some comfort. The economic impact of Carl's death rippled beyond just his family. The trucking company lost an experienced driver who would be difficult to replace, and faced increased insurance premiums and liability exposure related to the incident. The cleanup of the accident site, the recovery of the damaged vehicle, and the disposal of contaminated cargo cost over $60,000. The state of Montana incurred substantial expenses for the investigation and the subsequent bear hunt, and Rebecca Whitman, who had been a part-time dental hygienist, was forced to increase her work hours to full-time to make up for the loss of Carl's income, despite the settlement from the state, because the financial obligations of raising a child alone were daunting and ongoing. The philosophical questions raised by Carl's death about humanity's relationship with nature about the ethics of predator conservation, about acceptable levels of risk in modern society, remained largely unresolved. Wildlife advocates argued that Carl's death, while tragic, was an extreme outlier that didn't justify rolling back grizzly bear conservation efforts that had brought the species back from the brink of extinction in the lower 48 states. They pointed out that car accidents killed tens of thousands of Americans every year, but society didn't ban automobiles, and that the statistical risk of dying in a bear attack was infinitesimally small compared to many everyday dangers people accepted without question. Conversely, those skeptical of aggressive predator conservation asked pointed questions about whose lives were being risked by policies that prioritized bear populations, noting that the people most likely to encounter dangerous bears were rural residents and workers like Carl, who didn't have the luxury of avoiding bear country and who bore disproportionate risks so that urban environmentalists could feel good about wildlife conservation. These debates, passionate and often heated, played out in public meetings, in newspaper editorial pages, and in online forums, but rarely produced consensus or meaningful resolution. The fundamental tension between human safety and wildlife conservation was not something that could be easily solved, because it involved trade-offs that different people weighted very differently based on their values, experiences, and proximity to actual risk. What Carl Whitman's death did accomplish was to inject a stark human dimension into what had often been an abstract policy debate, providing a specific, named, tragically real example of what could happen when human-bear conflict went catastrophically wrong. Montana's tourism industry, which relied heavily on the state's wild character and abundant wildlife as selling points, watched the aftermath of Carl's death with some anxiety, concerned that national media coverage of a fatal bear attack might discourage visitors from coming to the state. In reality, tourism numbers for Montana showed only a slight dip in the summer of 2024 compared to the previous year, and had rebounded fully by 2025, suggesting that most people correctly understood that Carl's death was an extreme outlier and not representative of typical experiences in Montana. In fact, some tourism professionals reported that inquiries about bear safety increased after the incident, with visitors asking more questions about how to recreate responsibly in bear country, which led to better informed tourists and potentially fewer dangerous situations overall. The closure that Rebecca Whitman sought, that sense of resolution that would allow her to move forward with her life, remained frustratingly elusive even years after Carl's death. Closure, she came to understand, was largely a myth perpetuated by movies and television shows where grief followed a neat trajectory from devastation to acceptance. Real grief, she discovered, was messier and more complicated, arriving in waves at unexpected moments. Hearing a song Carl had liked on the radio, seeing a Peterbilt truck on the highway, watching Emma's face and seeing Carl's features reflected there, waking up in the middle of the night and reaching for Carl before remembering he wasn't there and never would be again. The passage of time made the grief more manageable, helped her function better day to day, but it never entirely went away. It just became part of who she was, a permanent shadow she carried with her. The staff at the Yellowstone County Medical Examiner's office kept a small memorial in their break room. A photograph of Carl Whitman alongside photographs of other victims whose deaths had particularly affected the staff over the years. It was a private acknowledgement of the emotional toll their work sometimes took, a recognition that behind every case number and autopsy report was a person who had mattered to someone, whose loss had created ripples of pain that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of death. Dr. Patricia Yuen, who retired in 2027, mentioned in her farewell speech to the staff that Carl's case was one she'd never forgotten, one that had reminded her why their work mattered, why treating everybody with dignity and producing thorough, accurate reports was so important because they were often the last advocates for people who could no longer speak for themselves. The stretch of Highway 87, where Carl died, remained largely unchanged in appearance, the prairie grass growing tall through the summer months before turning golden and then brown in the fall, the endless sky arching overhead in its perfect blue dome, the mountains standing sentinel on the horizon. Occasionally, FWP wardens patrolling the area stopped their vehicles near the site, stepped out, and stood for a moment looking at the unremarkable landscape where something so remarkable and terrible had occurred. Some of them said silent prayers or offered quiet words of remembrance. Others simply stood in contemplation before getting back in their trucks and continuing their patrols, knowing that they were the thin line between civilization and the wild, tasked with an impossible job of maintaining balance in a system where perfect safety was unattainable and every decision involved trade-offs that could have life or death consequences. Emma Whitman's therapist noted in her case files, with Rebecca's permission, that Emma's long-term prognosis was good, that the resilience children could demonstrate in the face of trauma was remarkable and hopeful. Emma would always carry the scars of losing her father so young and in such terrible circumstances, but those scars didn't have to define her entire life. With love, support, and appropriate therapeutic intervention, Emma could grow into a healthy, functional adult who remembered her father with love, rather than being paralyzed by the trauma of his death. The therapist emphasized that Emma's recovery was aided enormously by Rebecca's own strength and willingness to seek help, that children took their cues from parents about how to process trauma, and that Rebecca's efforts to mourn openly while also maintaining structure and normalcy in Emma's life had given her daughter permission to feel her grief while also moving forward. The legacy of Carl Joseph Whitman, in the end, extended far beyond the 6 minutes of terror that ended his life. His death sparked policy changes that improved bear management. His story raised awareness about human-wildlife conflict and the challenges of coexistence. His memory motivated scholarship programs and safety initiatives in the trucking industry. And his love for his family, evident in everything that Rebecca and Emma shared about him, provided a model of fatherhood and partnership that inspired those who heard his story. Carl had lived an ordinary life in many ways, working a blue-collar job, raising a family, paying his bills, finding small joys in daily existence. But his death had given his life a significance he never sought, and would have happily foregone if it meant he could have lived to old age with the people he loved. In June 2027, 3 years after Carl's death, Rebecca and Emma returned to Montana one final time. They drove down Highway 87, stopped at the approximate site where Carl had died, and stood together in the prairie grass under the vast sky. Emma, now 10 years old and clutching a bouquet of wildflowers they'd picked along the way, walked a few steps away from her mother and laid the flowers on the ground. She stood with her head bowed for a moment, her lips moving in silent words, then returned to Rebecca's side. They held hands, mother and daughter, and looked out across the landscape where Carl had breathed his last, where a grizzly bear had claimed his life, where the intersection of human ambition and wild nature had produced tragedy. The wind blew across the prairie, stirring the grass in long, rolling waves that looked like the ocean, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, its call echoing across the emptiness. Then Rebecca and Emma returned to their car, pulled back onto Highway 87, and drove north toward Billings, toward the airport, toward home, carrying Carl's memory with them always, learning to live with loss, moving forward because that's what the living must do, even when those we love are gone forever, and the world feels emptier for their absence. The prairie remained, and the bears remained, and life continued its inexorable march forward, indifferent to human tragedy, yet somehow, in the resilience of survivors like Rebecca and Emma, also demonstrating the remarkable capacity for healing and hope that made human existence bearable even in the face of unbearable loss.